Okay, it looks like we're up. We're going to come to order. Today is the regular meeting of the regular February 3rd, 2010 regular meeting of the Planning Commission, City of Glendale. Could you call roll, please?
Commissioner Landrigan.
Here.
Commissioner Lee.
Here.
Commissioner Sheets.
Here.
Commissioner Yasayan.
Here.
And Chair Kane.
Here. Report regarding posting of agenda, please.
The agenda for this meeting was posted on Wednesday, January 27, 2010, on the bulletin board outside of City Hall.
All right, thank you. Would everyone stand and please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, agenda item 4, approval of minutes. We have 2 minutes to approve. First, December 2nd, 2009. Comments or corrections?
I move that we accept the minutes for December 2nd.
Seeking support?
I second it.
All right, we have a motion and support. Call roll for approval of the minutes.
Commissioner Landrigan.
Abstain.
Commissioner Lee.
Abstain.
Commissioner Sheets.
Aye.
Commissioner Yasayan.
Aye.
And Chair Kane.
Aye, and a vote of 3-0 with 2 abstentions. The minutes of December 2nd, 2009 have been approved. And now for the meetings of December 16th.
So move approval.
I second.
Motion support. Call roll, please.
Commissioner Landrigan.
Yes.
Commissioner Lee.
Abstain.
Commissioner Sheets.
Aye.
Commissioner Yasayan.
Aye.
And Chair Kane.
Aye, and a vote of 4-0 with 1 abstention. The minutes of December 16th, 2009 have been approved. Agenda item 5, oral communications, discussion for items not on the agenda. I have no cards. Agenda item 7, Planning Commission items. We have under old business zoning code amendment case PZON 2009-004. This had been continued from October 21st, November 4th, and both of 2009 and January 20th of 2010. And I understand staff is suggesting that be continued again.
Yes, sir. We're still working through some comments by some housing advocates.
And your suggestion is to continue to a date certain on March 17th,
Yes.
2010, without further notification. Comments from the commission? We have a motion to continue the item, please.
So moved. Second.
Motion support. Call roll, please.
Commissioner Landrigan.
Yes.
Commissioner Lee.
Aye.
Commissioner Yasayan.
Aye.
Commissioner Sheets.
Aye.
And Chair Kane.
Aye, and a vote of 5-0, zoning code amendment case PZON 2009-004 is continued to March 17th, 2010, without further notice. We are going to go slightly out of agenda order. We're going to hold off on the cell tower item until about 6 o'clock or so. And as a result, we're going to take use variance case PVAR 2009-047. Now, that's going to, I think, make about half the people here happy and half unhappy. Okay. So we'll introduce the case. Its location is 327 and 331 Salem Street and city parking lot number 12. It's a use variance application to allow the development of live-work units included as part of a new 4-story, 36-unit affordable housing project located in the R1250 high-density residential zone where such use is not permitted by the zoning code. A mitigated negative declaration PEIF 2009-017 was made public from January 2nd, 2010 to February 1st, 2010. However, no comments were received. The applicant is Rodney Kahn of Kahn Consulting. Staff is represented by Eric Kraus, and it is a motion that we approve, the staff recommendation, rather, is a motion that we approve the PVR 2009-047. Staff overview, please.
Good evening, Chairman Kane, members of the Planning Commission. The case before you tonight is use variance case number PVAR 2009-047. It's located at 327 and 331 Salem Street in City Park Lot number 12. And that's 4 lots totaling approximately 27,900 square feet. The applicant is Kahn Consulting. and the general plan designation is high-density residential. The zoning is R1250, and there's a parking structure overlay zone on the 2 lots where the parking lot currently resides. The applicant is seeking assistance from the Glendale Housing Authority to construct a new 4-story, 36-unit affordable rental housing project that comprised of 4 artist lofts, each containing 1 bedroom, 14 2-bedroom units, 9 3-bedroom units, 9 4-bedroom units. The 4 live-work units will be located on the ground floor fronting along Salem Street. The purpose of the use variance is to allow the live-work units in the R1250 zone where they're not currently allowed under the zoning. A mitigated negative declaration was prepared as PEIF 2009-017. As Chairman Kane indicated, the noticing period was from January 2nd, 2010 to February 1st, 2010. And we did actually receive 1 comment on the mitigated neg deck that I included earlier today, gave you guys a response to that comment as part of the final mitigated neg deck. And we also received public comments from 5 or 6 or so that I provided to you guys earlier this evening as well. The applicant also requested concessions and waivers under the city's density bonus housing ordinance. That was heard by the zoning hearing officer this morning at 9:30. Actually, there's a DRB meeting scheduled for March 4th at 5 p.m. as well, and then a housing authority meeting scheduled on March 16th. In order to approve the use variance that's being requested, there's 4 findings that need to be made. That's pursuant to Section 3043-030 of the Glendale Municipal Code. And those findings are that the strict application of the provisions of any such ordinance would result in practical difficulties, unnecessary hardship, inconsistent with the general purpose and intent of the ordinance, and that there are exceptional circumstances or conditions applicable to the property involved or to the intended use of the development of the property that do not apply generally to other property in the same zone or neighborhood, that granting of the variance will not be materially detrimental to the public welfare or injurious to the property or improvements in such zone or neighborhood in which the property is located, and lastly, the granting of the variance will not be contrary to the objectives of the ordinance. Staff did an evaluation that was included in the staff report, and we believe that all 4 findings required to approve the use variance could be met, and recommend that the Planning Commission approve the use variance. That concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Questions from the commission for staff at this time? I have a question, and it's more of a clarification. You noted in our paperwork it indicated that the applicant seeking approval from the zoning hearing officer for concessions and so on for a variety of things, and I believe you said that session was held this morning?
Yes, I was at 9:30. And there's under the density bonus ordinance, based on the amount of affordability that's provided as part of the project, the applicants allowed up to 3 concessions from the zoning code. And the concessions that they're requesting was for height, which they want to build a building that's 41 feet height when its allowable height is 36 feet. However, you could actually go up to 41 feet in that zone, provided that you provide the roof pitch that's 3 and 12 feet, but they're not providing the pitch. So they're requesting concession for height, a concession to allow a 4th story, and then a concession for, bear with me here 1 second.
Setbacks?
Yeah, setbacks is actually a waiver. Floor area ratio for the concessions. And then in addition to those, you could also request additional waivers from the code. And the ones they're actually requesting are to reduce the parking to 58 spaces when 81 spaces are required by the density bonus ordinance, and also for not meeting the minimum setback requirements for averaging on the front setback.
All right. And then carrying that forward, again, specifically, the only portion of this that's in front of us today is allowing live work as part of the project.
That's correct.
All the other things, the height ratio, the floor area ratios, height, parking, setbacks, and all that were handled in the hearing from this morning?
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
Okay. All right. Mr. Lee, or Mr. Yes.
The question is that, even though the hearing was conducted this morning regarding those concessions, this use variance also, for the live work, use variance also I think has to deal with parking space requirements. So can we revisit that? Because I have some questions about the parking requirements associated with that. And, from this board here, impose some additional conditions if we, elect to do that.
I'll let council weigh in.
Yeah, that would help.
But I guess I would preface by saying as long as the parking aspect relates to the impact of live work, I
Yes.
think it'd be quite appropriate. Mr. Garcia?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. There were two aspects of the parking that were under consideration by the zoning hearing officer. One is related to the mandatory parking concession that the city is essentially required to provide for a project that provides the level of affordability that this project is providing. So with respect to those parking spaces, those were essentially mandatorily granted, or would be mandatorily it would be required that the city provide that parking concession. As far as the additional parking concession above and beyond that, again, that was within the zoning hearing officer's discretion. As it relates, as you stated, Mr. Kane, as it relates to the approval of this use, the live-work component, as that relates to the parking, I think that's within the discretion, but I think there have to be some factual evidence to support some additional conditions as it relates to parking. And if I would have to hear what the commissioners are thinking in terms of what you're proposing. I'm not sure that this body could require additional parking above and beyond what the zoning hearing officer ultimately says is the proper amount of parking under the concessions that are being granted. So I guess the answer is it's going to depend on what I hear from you.
We'll see where we go.
Right.
All Mr. Lee?
I do have this specific question to the staff. What was the concession that you made for this live work space? How many spaces were allotted, or counted towards that, credited towards this live work space?
Yeah, they
and
did.
What is it
Oh,
that
excuse me.
the city requires, and what was the concession?
Essentially, what they're providing is one parking space per unit for the one bedroom, and then also one additional space for guests. Now, in the density bonus ordinance, there's no set standard in terms of live-work units as far as parking ratios. What the code does require under the normal R1250 standards would be 3 parking spaces for the first 2,000 square feet. I believe that those units are about approximately 1,000 square feet each. So an analysis was conducted in the parking study that kind of looked at what would be appropriate for those live-work units in terms of the amount of parking that should be allocated for those.
Is it correct that if I assume that you use maybe the formula for commercial zoning applied to this live work, or no?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Mr. Hargani?
No, we actually would not. We came up with a parking ratio for live work when we looked at the San Fernando Road rezoning, and we looked at the ways that many different cities look at it, and nobody had a good solution. We came up, I believe, in the San Fernando Road, I need to look at it, we came up with a formula that seemed the most reasonable based on the live-work units that had been built up until then in many cities, and based on the parking demand that the different cities had learned. And so for that, and we learned I remember very clearly that we looked at the ratio for commercial, and we learned that the commercial ratio would not really apply because of the nature of the combination of the uses.
Let me just explain why, I'm bringing this up, and where I want to go with this is that, I saw in the report, and obviously, all the concession was made, and we're not to go over the concessions that was made this morning. But then also there's a report by the Department of Neighborhood Services, and then also some of the concerns that were brought up here was that that area is a parking impacted, and also the parking demand analysis by the private consultant. I don't know how accurate it is, but it does say it requires 57, but it is quite a bit of a reduction from 81 that's required. So I do have a little concern about this applied or concession that we made on this project. And I want to relate that back to the this live-work use variance to see if we can raise this question again and perhaps, encourage developer or to participate in this process, maybe, contributing to the transportation fund that we have, so that, there is a give and take here. But that's the direction I'm taking this to.
Okay. Any other questions for staff at this time? All right. Seeing.
I did have.
Oh,
I'm
please.
sorry.
I'm sorry, Mr.
Along the
Sheets.
same line, just for clarity on my part, this, we identify in the package that the upper level will contain a total of 37 parking spaces, including 4 accessible parking spaces and 33 standard spaces. What is accessible parking spaces?
Oh, that would be for handicap parking.
Okay. And then, I'm not clear on how is it anticipated that the live-work units will be used as far as the work component?
I would like to defer that to the applicant to see how they think that should work. But I also know because the Housing Authority is involved in the project, they're going to basically, as part of, I guess they would call it an agreement with the funding that's being used, to give an idea of what those artist units could be used for. So,
Okay. And then one last one, just to help me understand. Within the analysis, it mentions some of the logic behind the parking issue, and it says, in addition to the 58 on-site parking spaces provided for the subject would be more than sufficient for the residents and their guests visiting the building. As a result of the project's proximity to downtown, the fact that low-income families have fewer cars, I don't know that would be something that I ask you, maybe it needs to defer also, but is that factual or is that an assumption?
well, it's based on the parking analysis that was submitted as part of the project from the environmental review, and they had done, as part of this study, they looked at some existing affordable housing projects in Glendale, one in particular, Metro City Lights, which I believe was parked fully to code. And so they've done studies to determine how much of those spaces are actually being used. And then I guess they were looking at some, it was based on, because the study was based on a previous study that was conducted for some other affordable housing projects in the city, which looked at, I believe in the applicant can correct me if I'm wrong, looked at some other sites in other cities that were similar scale and type of use and everything. So the numbers that they came up with were based on actual usage of existing affordable housing projects, and so that's what they based the numbers on.
I have a follow-up question on that. If there's enough study on this affordable housing where, it says that, it does require less parking spaces, whether it's a senior housing or affordable housing, I know that in our code does not, really address that, other than, when there's a project like this, there are some concessions made, for that, provisions made for that. It's not a matter of, this case or today's hearing, but I'd like the staff to take a look at that for the future reference, so that there's no question regarding this here, that, set some sort of, if there's enough study on this subject, that, maybe we need to tie some numbers to that applies directly to low-income housing and, also to senior housing.
Question for staff or Mr. Garcia. Isn't it a state-mandated reduction that we're kind of passing through as it relates to affordable housing and a parking reduction?
That's correct. The SB 1818 is a state law that was adopted a few years ago that both the density bonus and all the incentives, including parking, are being approved under.
Okay.
I had one.
Please. Sure.
Regarding the live-work units, would there be normal standards in the city as far as how many people would be able to occupy those live-work units? It seemed to be like a flat to me, as I could tell from the...
We don't regulate that in the zoning code. We'd be preempted under the state building code to whatever the maximums are under the building code, and Mr. Kane could probably speak to this, but they're pretty generous as far as how many people you can fit in a particular unit and what's
How tall can you stack the bunk beds?
right, pretty much.
Okay.
Question, with an EIR, if I recall, and an applicant gives the city money and the city goes out and basically hires the consultant. With the parking study, isn't that paid directly by the applicant to the parking consultant?
You're correct with EIRs, we do contract out for consultants to prepare the EIRs. Usually, if the applicant would submit a parking study or something like that as part of the application that requires an EIR, we would have the consultant do a peer review of those studies that they prepared. In essence, for this one, in this case, we did have our traffic and transportation department take a look at the parking study that was prepared.
Okay,
And
so basically, the applicant hired the transportation consultant who prepared the report, but then peer review was done by the city's transportation department.
That's correct. And in terms of for this project, because it was a mitigated negative declaration, not an EIR, that's prepared in-house. We don't contract that out with anyone else. City staff would prepare the environmental in that case.
Oh, I know. I just was
okay.
contrasting the difference in terms of, let's say, fiduciary responsibility.
Yeah. So if they didn't have, if somebody came in and had to do an EIR and they didn't have consultants, then as part of the EIR contract, we would ask that they would hire subs to prepare those documents.
Mr. Chair, and also in the zoning code, under the parking reduction permit chapter, the code actually allows applicants to provide any kind of evidence that whether it's something that they hired a consultant to produce or they have statistics from their industry or any sort of information that may help to make a case, and then staff reviews that. So that is as it's spelled out in the code.
Right, but that would be more of a voluntary, I'm developing all this type of stuff. With an EIR, one of the reasons that the city hires it is to create any sort of, eliminate a potential conflict of interest, where the guy that's paying for the EIR hires it, and by everyone's aware who signs their check, and to avoid the potential of, let's say, tweaking the data based on who pays for it. And so I was just identifying, to guard against that, what did we do as a city? And you said we dealt with it internally in peer review.
Correct.
Okay. Any other questions for staff at this time? I promise we'll have another opportunity to talk to them. All right.
Were there any, I'm sorry, one question. Were there any comments or changes after the peer review was done to the parking study?
No, there were not, because the traffic consultant was in direct contact with our transportation staff and what they were going to be looking for in terms of what the study should look like. So they were working in conjunction to prepare that as well. So,
If I may add, the city did a little bit of extra research in terms of the use of Lot 12 at night. I think was not provided in the applicant study. And we had some of our transportation staff as well as patrol officers look at the usage of the lot at night to see if it was being used for overnight parking. And the various times we checked found either only 2 or 1 car in the lot in the overnight hours.
How many times was it checked?
We checked once at, I will admit this was on the same day, it was checked once at, I think,
it was,
PM?
it was 10 p.m. and then again at 2:25 a.m. and then 5 or 5:30 a.m.
5:30 a.m.
That was one day, one night?
Yes. It turns out that quite apart from this project, the city had previously changed the metering hours on this lot, that the meters were extended, run from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
So that alone would probably greatly diminish, the desire of anyone to park overnight there.
Well,
If they had to get out
it
and
drove
move.
people out of the lots and onto searching for a place on the
Yes.
street.
Right.
Whether that was a good idea or bad, that's the consequence.
Do we know, when was that made? When was that change made?
I believe it was the first of the year?
I think it started being implemented in the fall, and it got slowly implemented by the time the holidays arrived. So,
What, like a meter at a time?
no, it was more one location at a time.
So it's not just this location that?
Throughout downtown and some of the spill-off areas.
Okay.
We don't know what it was like before that, the parking situation?
Do you want to speak to that, Tim? In the environmental review, we had gotten some numbers based on meter usage that we got. That was from 2007, 2008 fiscal year, and according to the funding, the money that came in from the meters, this lot was used about 16% of the time was
Sorry, 16?
16% was on occupancy based on the parking meters.
I guess the question I have then, was any observation done on the weekends when people would be shopping?
Not by city staff, no.
I would assume that metering count included the weekends.
Well, the meters, well, except for Sundays when the meters aren't enforced. So on Saturdays, when the meters are enforced, that would be included in that, but it wasn't recently looked
So
at.
what we're dealing with is basically an anecdotal snapshot of the lot at one night. It's not statistically relevant, it's just kind of anecdotal. It was kind of a, well, at least let's check it out and see what it looks like on that particular night.
Correct, yeah.
All right. Any other questions for staff at this time? Of the designer, the owner of the property, and yourself, is there any other interested party that is going to be part of?
Not that I'm aware of. Okay. And you would consider those three people to be part of your team? Sure. Very good. You have 15 minutes to present your case.
Great. Thank you very much. Good evening, Chairman, Commissioners, City staff, and those here in the audience. My name is Rodney Kahn. My offices are located at 1111 North Brand Boulevard, Suite 403, here in the city of Glendale. As was mentioned, we were here this morning, so here we are again this evening. This morning addressed many of those issues, and I'll kind of deviate a little bit from my presentation just to kind of touch on some of what was discussed just now. As it relates to the parking study, we had our parking consultant meet directly with the city's Traffic and Transportation Division. They defined what the scope of the work and the study was, not us. The city did. And in terms of the analysis that was done, yes, the city staff went out there the one night. We had our parking consultant out there on 10 separate occasions. Myself, over the past few months, I can't tell you how many times I've been out there. It's in terms of the use of that lot is one of the most underutilized lots in the city of Glendale. Clearly, you can see that confirmed in documentation, and for whatever reason, Traffic and Transportation is not here, but they also would confirm that as well. What we are here this evening for is for the live-work units. And out of a project of 36 affordable housing units, we are proposing 4. And this is something very new and different for us. I worked with ADI, I mentioned this morning. This is our 5th project that we're doing, affordable housing project here in the city of Glendale. So slowly but surely we actually learn things as we progress and build the projects. One of the things we learned was that we were building a lot of parking, spending a lot of money on that component that was going unused that we could actually spend to build more affordable housing units. So thus the study, thus the analysis, and thus the working with the Traffic and Transportation. As it relates to these units themselves, we tried to design them in such a way that they had direct access from the street so that people didn't have to go up into the project and disperse. Each of the 4 units can be accessed off of Salem Street. The unit sizes are about 1,000 square feet. They consist of a gallery area, kind of a work area, sleeping area, restrooms, and kitchen facilities. In terms of the determination of how we would place them, that seemed the most logical place for them to be. In terms of the location of our site, as I mentioned, is a very, very, I mentioned this morning, is a very, very key, very, very good location here in the city of Glendale. The reason being is we're in close proximity, walking distance to a number of different retail shops, restaurants, other recreational facilities. I mentioned today about the bus line, the B line, and I was told Central, that's changing a little bit, but a block away on Broadway, there's quite a bit of public transportation. So that certainly makes sense. We're also, as it relates to the Central Business District and the Downtown Specific Plan, we're about 50 feet away, which is about a lot away. If we were in the Downtown Specific Plan, we would not be here this evening because live-work units are permitted uses by right in this area. In fact, they're very much encouraged. There was talk about environmental and CEQA analysis. We did a noise study. We also did a parking study. Also to mention, which is exciting for us, is this is the first affordable housing project that's actually LEED certified. And so we're not just LEED certified, we're actually silver LEED certified, which is something that we're very proud of. A few comments as it relates to the housing element, and then I'll touch a little bit upon the necessary findings that needed to be made. First of all, I looked at the housing element of the general plan, which was updated January of 2009. That was the last update that was taking place. Goal number 1 states that a city with a wide range of housing types to meet the needs of current and future residents should be encouraged. So I took that and I looked at the different policies that would apply, and in particular to this project and to this use for what we're discussing here this evening. 1.3 talks about providing higher density residential development in close proximity to public transportation, services, and recreation. That's certainly what we're doing. Policy 1.4, continue to promote residential mixed-use development, including live-work units in appropriate locations. There's been live-work units that have been discussed about being in the downtown area or adjacent areas. None of those have been constructed. Unfortunately, we hope that they will be. If this is approved, these will be constructed. And then finally, as it relates to this item, Policy 1.9, encourage flexibility in the zoning ordinance to promote a wide range of housing types. The use variance itself, and as it relates to what we're discussing here this evening, there is a layout as it relates to the floor plan and the way it was functioned. We are now in the process of defining what is an artist, because in terms of an artist flat, what is an artist? Who would qualify for that? There's talk about a fine artist, such as a painter, or as a photographer, where you may not want, say, a welder, or something along those lines. So there will certainly be clarification as it relates to the use. We're also talking about the hours of operation, because in terms of being compatible with the neighborhood and also being compatible with the rest of the units is very important to us. And then finally, as it relates to regulation, we have on-site managers. We have a unit that's dedicated for that. We also have an office that's dedicated to that, which is a little bit different than a market rate type project, which may or may not have that. So we have reporting requirements and we have strict regulations. The reason being, we're affordable housing. And our affordability breaks down into, we have low-income units, we have very low-income units, and we have extremely low-income units. And 100% of our project is affordable. There's no market rate component to it whatsoever, including the 4 live-work units we're here discussing this evening. I have a couple, I'm trying to make sure I'm not taking too much time as it relates to some of my colleagues. I know they have some comments. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the different analysis that was done as it relates to the live-work units. The live-work units, we originally had talked about how does this make sense in proximity to what's going on in the downtown, specifically in the downtown specific plan, where all of us have worked so hard on trying to encourage specific uses in that area. One is there's an arts district in the downtown, and it certainly made a lot of sense to us, and it made sense to some council members that thought this was a very good idea to include this component in the project. It's new, it's different, it's not anywhere else. We've never done it as affordable housing. So for us, we're kind of walking into a little bit of a gray area ourselves. But we're excited to do it. We think it makes a lot of sense, and we hope you guys do too. I want to conclude my remarks because I want my colleagues to also speak. But I would like to, and I could either do it now or I can do it in the rebuttal period because I know there are some speakers here, talk a little bit about the findings if we need to talk about that at this time.
It's your choice. You'll have 15 minutes in rebuttal. I would prefer that rebuttal truly be limited to responses of the comments. So I really suspect that you should present that now.
Okay. I'd be happy to do that. 4 findings that need to be made, as staff suggested that they felt that they could be made. I'll just back that up a little bit. First item, that the proposed use will be consistent with the various elements and objectives of the general plan. I talked about the housing element of the general plan already, and how what we are proposing is consistent with that element. In terms of the overall project and the Glendale Municipal Code, a live-work unit means an integrated dwelling unit and working space occupied and utilized by a single housekeeping unit in a structure that has been modified or designed to accommodate joint residential occupancy and work activity. And that's exactly how we've designed our project, to include kitchen and sanitary facilities in compliance with applicable building standards. Our building standards, our fire code, engineering codes, all the codes will be met with our project. The second item, as it relates to use and associated structures, not being detrimental to the health or safety or welfare or the environment. The site itself right now is a commercial parking lot. There's 2 lots to the west that's also included. Those are now vacant lots. Those lots have been sitting for some time. They tend to gather debris. They're not the most aesthetically pleasing with the chain link fence. I think in terms of our project being an asset to the neighborhood aesthetically and both functionally, that I think that something that's taking place as a result of our design. I mentioned that the building is designed to achieve Silver LEED certification, which incorporates many green building components, everything from recycled carpets, drought-tolerant landscaping, also with the list goes on and on and on. The use and facilities will not adversely affect or conflict with adjacent uses or impede the normal development of surrounding property. The context of the area, we have to our north, we have commercial parking lots and multifamily residential, same to the south. To the west is a 2-story building, residential. To the east is a commercial parking lot and a 6-story office building. The final item is adequate public and private facilities such as utilities, landscaping, parking, traffic circulation measures are or will be provided for the proposed use. We already have service as it relates to public and private utilities. Our CEQA analysis looked at all of those components as it relates to our project. Would we be able to meet those or fulfill those, both from a city perspective and a private perspective? That was to the affirmative, yes, we will. In terms of the studies and the analysis, we agree with the CEQA document, with the 2 mitigation measures that are being suggested and recommended to us, and we'd be happy to comply with them. I'll leave you on this thought. The city of Glendale, as you guys know, is in dire need of affordable housing. End of story, period. The reason that there is a density bonus ordinance is to create affordable housing, because it doesn't get created on its own. It has to be heavily subsidized by the city of Glendale. It also has to be heavily subsidized by the state through tax credits. The way we get tax credits is we compete. We compete with other affordable housing projects. There's criteria that we compete with. One is cost, one is location, one is number of units, a whole list of things. In order for us to compete, to possibly get the funding for this project, these are the minimum, this use variance and these the previous hearing that we had this morning, those are the minimum items we need in order to compete to hopefully get this project funded. I'll conclude my remarks. Obviously, if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Do we want to hold our questions and hear from the rest of his group, or would you like?
I have nothing right now.
Let's hear from the rest of your
Great. Thank you.
group.
Good evening. My name is Carlos Ovalle. I'm the architect for the project. I've been working on affordable housing for the majority of my career, which is 27 years now. And I wanted to talk about a couple of things. To address the parking issue, this issue comes up at every affordable housing project that I've ever done, or nearly every affordable housing project ever since I started working on this in this field. And there's an interesting study that was done by an independent association, by the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. This study was conducted over the years and published in 2004. I don't have a copy of it, but it's easily searched on the web, scamf.org. And it also compiles independent studies throughout the nation, mostly centered around Southern California, but it also covers all the way up to Canada. A very interesting study that I would encourage you to read, or anybody interested in affordable housing as it relates to parking. LEED. I am a LEED accredited professional, one of the pioneers of LEED back in the day, and it's been a passion of mine forever since before it existed, and I'm really excited to participate in this project with ADI and to help bring greening to the city of Glendale. One of the most important aspects in terms of building green is not just installing photovoltaic cells and drought-tolerant plants and all these sort of things that people like to do that are interesting to look at, and they're really wow kind of points. But one of the items that has the biggest impact on the carbon footprint of any building is the reduction in square footage. In all the affordable housing projects that I have ever worked on, parking, even under severe parking reductions, is greatly underutilized. So we have to spend a lot of concrete, a lot of reinforcing steel, tractors to dig up all this dirt. Then we have to transport all this dirt out somewhere to dump it. And now our underutilized garage is built, and then it has to be maintained. We have to have constantly operating ventilation systems sucking the air out and keeping it moving, and it is all extremely wasteful and one of the worst environmental things that can happen. Further, encouraging having cars, because what do you do with that empty space? You can't use it. You can't put an apartment in the basement. We would rather take all that energy, all that money, and put it into a space that can be used. That concludes my remarks. I will be available for questions.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Khan, was the property owner going to speak or not? All right.
Can I ask you what the name is?
Sandy, you're not the owner of the property, you're an owner of a property. All right. Because I sensed Mr. Khan was interested in who his third participant was. So, all right. All right, Mr. Khan, if you'd approach, we'll see if there are some questions based on your presentation. From the commission, do we have questions for Mr. Khan?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Lee?
I have a couple of questions, and one that I guess in the beginning I alluded to that, one of the contributing into the transportation fund. But before that, I want to talk about what you have mentioned about hours of operation, and then also defining yourself, I guess, what the artist's definition of artist. That's who's going to go into the live workspace. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's in the downtown specific plan, Alex Theater District. So I'm assuming that the live work space will have some sort of a relationship with that. Now, you also mentioned, the artist. What does that involve? Is that welder? You have some artist things that by putting pieces of metals together, he's an artist. But obviously, something like that would not fit into the picture here. So, is that something that you are going to self-impose or define? Who will be your tenant? Who are the ones that you will be going after? So defining artists, and are you going to self-impose hours of operation of that live workspace? So then if you do, then that's something that we want to consider working into our conditions, because it's not in our conditions here. The second question is that, as you mentioned, yes, everybody's excited. Everybody needs this affordable housing. So there's a great subsidized incentives that from the city to promote this type of projects, and we all agree with that. But we're also looking for, something from the maybe from the property owner to be a good neighbor, to see if when this project goes along, and because we're making all these concessions, and this was not part of the concession, or in the conversation we had this morning from the ZA, that I want to bring this up here. So whenever we promote this type of project, I'd like to see some sort of a participation from the landlord, maybe by giving you all these parking concessions, or making this project going from 81 required to 58, and I'm not questioning the demand analysis that you made, but that used to be the parking spaces, that's taken away, and then we're now, in addition to that, we're going from 81 to 58. And that is a impacted area as far as parking goes. So I'm not going to go into that. But by making all these concessions, is the property owner willing to contribute some funding so that into the transportation fund in the downtown specific plan, so that everybody wins on this project.
Why don't you try the first question?
I heard a couple questions in there, so I'll try to define them. First of all, I just want to be very, very clear. This is a partnership with the City of Glendale. So this is not in terms of us dictating as to what the definition of an artist is going to be, or in terms of us moving forward. This is something where it's not just us. It's the City of Glendale, it's us, and it's also the state, because it has to follow fair housing laws. We can't just randomly pick and do things as it relates to this type of housing. It has to have some basis for what we're doing. We had been cited a project in San Francisco that had something like this, that had artist flats that were affordable, and we are studying that now with the city, with community development and housing, as our partner. In terms of the regulations or restrictions on those units, whatever criteria that the city looks at, then they will. It doesn't work the other way around. I'm not telling the city what we're doing. The city is saying, these are the types of uses that are allowed. This is the fair housing law. These are what we see the hours of operation. That's one piece of it. The second piece of it, you talked about, you'd like to see if all these concessions are being given, then somehow that the costs that we are saving be shared to the traffic or transportation fund. Okay, I say that to the city. Okay, that's fine. If that's the direction the city would like to take in terms of the money is coming from the city. The money is coming from these tax credits from the state. If we have saved X number of dollars, what we have done is we've showed where we're saving that. We said, how would you like us to spend that? Part of the response was, do a LEED building, do a silver LEED building. So it's not us taking the money and saying, okay, we've saved that money, now it's ours. It's us saying, how do we reallocate that money? It's a pot of money. How do we want to spend it? So I hope that helps a little bit. It's not us taking the money and saying, now we've saved that much in parking. It's saying, city, how would you like us to do this? The city tells us we want to do it this way, that's what we do.
Well, you've done it with the LEED, silver LEED certified, design, and you've done that already. But I guess what I'm saying is that will you take another extra step to consider, maybe giving into the transportation fund is.
We would we'd certainly consider it.
I think we're probably not able to impose a condition like that, are we, Mr. Garcia?
I'm sorry, I apologize. I was talking to Mr. Agani about
We can't create a condition where
it's not a condition.
Ask.
I'll just ask him.
Okay, okay. So you're just saying on a voluntary basis?
Voluntary basis, yeah. No, it's not imposed. I'm just saying, be a good neighbor.
We would consider it. Sure.
And I do have a question with the architect.
Okay. Well, we'll work through Mr. Khan. Please.
Yes, I did. Mr. Khan, would you educate me a little bit on work, live? Are these restricted by covenant so that you have to have a work-live situation, or do you have to, or can you not do the work and just live, or just do the work and not live?
Now, how do you prevent it from just becoming a one-bedroom?
That's a good question. I mean,
Yes.
yeah, I don't know if, I know Peter Zovak from Community Development and Housing is here. We're working through his department as it relates to to go back to the definition of artist, to go back to the self-imposed or the hours of operation. I don't know how that works in terms of requiring someone that occupies that space to actually work there. I don't know if we can. Maybe that's a legal question more than a planning type question.
I'll answer it.
I'm done.
Mr. Garcia.
Well, Mr. Agani and I were actually just having a side conversation about that. The definition is defined in the code, and it says both joint residential occupancy. I'm sorry, not on the mic. Okay. Sorry. The code defines live work to include, again, the joint residential occupancy and work activity. So as long as they're complying with that provision, I think that and we are working on additional covenants, so we probably still need to work on that a little bit as far as making sure it's not just work, if that's the intent of both parties.
In that instance, and I don't know which of
I'll add though that this is actually use variance, so the residential use is already permitted by the code. So
Right.
I'm not sure if we necessarily.
Well, but now the second part of that, to build on that though, is, because part of it is, okay, if we don't allow live work, you de facto get it as an apartment.
Right.
Now, in terms of definition, how many square feet are your one-bedroom apartments? How many square feet on average are your two-bedroom? And how many square feet are the artist flats on average?
The average artist flat's about 1,000 square feet. The two bedrooms are about 1,000 square feet. So it gives you an idea.
So, because part of, I think, what we're all dealing with here is then, just on a square footage basis, as a live-work unit, by definition, it suddenly becomes a one parking space deal with, one guest, I think, right? But if it wasn't an artist space, it would become de facto a two-bedroom, requiring an additional space.
No, let's step back for a second. You're on to something, but that's not necessarily accurate. Two-bedroom, first of all, it'd have to be, whether it's a large one-bedroom, the parking is based on the bedrooms. But let's just say, for your discussion purposes, it was 1,000 square feet, and now we did a two-bedroom instead of a one-bedroom. According to your density bonus ordinance, a two-bedroom would require 2 on-site parking spaces. That includes guest parking space.
There's no additional, like, .17?
No point nothing.
Okay.
It's just 2.
So
it'd
going
be-
from live work with 1+1, even if it became a two-bedroom...
It's a wash.
It's a wash. Thank you.
Sure.
Great.
May I continue on
Please.
that then? Thank you. I was going in that direction too. And I'm really curious because I think the live-work situation is certainly something that we should be pursuing. But I don't know all of the ins and outs of it. So the other question that I have is that if there is not a definition of what work is, and that work does become noxious, et cetera, any of those elements that would then be a detriment to the neighborhood, as opposed to, how would that affect the Fair Housing Act? Would you be able to evict a person whose work was in direct conflict with the remainder of the neighborhood?
I see the planning director raising his hand.
I think that's a very fair question. When the live-work definition was invented for the San Fernando Road corridor, specifically for SFMU zone, we looked at the list of the permitted commercial uses that could be used in the live-work units with that very specific question in mind. And based on that, we eliminated a lot of the commercial uses that could be permitted and limited to the other ones to certain types of activities. So I would recommend that if you are going to approve this request, then limit the live-work the commercial side of, or the activity side of the live work unit to those that are permitted in the SFMU zone, because we went through a lot of community meetings to get to that list.
Can you give us an idea of what the limitations were on the SF zone?
Yes. If you give me a second, I'll open up some of the list.
And I'm sorry.
And then one last question, even on that while you're looking, Hassan. And then, is there a limit on the time of work can happen in the live-work zone? Can you say you can only have business between 8 in the morning or 9 in the evening? Are those limitations available to meet within the neighborhood context?
I would like to say yes, we could. Part of it has to do with the fact that I think as you're getting the sense of this is a work in progress, if the city was to say you need to restrict the tenants to these hours of operation, that would be fine with us. I mean, we don't have any problems with limiting the uses, limiting the hours of operation, any of that.
Mr. Garcia, you wanted to
Just
chime in?
to add on to an earlier point that Mr. Khan made, as he intimated, the housing authority that's will be involved in this project may have an interest in regulating this issue too. So there will be covenants that will be imposed as well to probably, at a minimum, will require what we're going to be requiring under the zoning code definition of live work and the commercial uses that will be allowed, and maybe some additional restrictions as well. So obviously, if the commission has interest in making some comments there, then anything that's put out in this meeting will be obviously forwarded to the Housing Authority for its consideration as well.
Conceivably, we could put on conditions and then still have in a condition that additional conditions as may be opposed by the housing director or other city
Housing
agencies.
Authority, yeah.
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 Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. Any other questions from the board? I have a couple of.
Go ahead.
Okay. Work through with me. The units have to be considered accessible, but you don't. But that basically means you put in blocking and you're able to convert units to handicap, I presume. So you put in blocking, but there's none predestined for handicap because you just don't know what unit it would involve. Correct?
Yeah.
What about parking for handicap vehicles on the site? I don't see anything identified or pre-identified.
If you look at the second drawing there,
Did I miss that?
and it says HHH,
Yeah, I get what that is. I just, I blew right past it when I was looking at the floor plan.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
And is 8 foot 6 inches still considered an appropriate parking space width by the city?
Yes.
We don't recognize compacts per se, but
Right, we do not recognize compacts.
we do allow 8.6.
Yes.
Okay, just double checking on those things.
Sure.
Is not so much a question for you, but it would a permitted use, because I think we're going in the same direction too about the live-work aspect and how it would impact not only residents of the complex but also adjacent neighbors. Artists have receptions, artists have exhibits, and that type of thing. Is using the phrase artist maybe a little loosely, is a tattoo artist a permitted use in live workspace?
Potentially, yes.
Okay. Because that would be kind of an interesting
Reception.
clientele and hours of operation type of thing. Not that there's anything wrong with that. So, all right. I don't know that I have anything right now. Obviously, we'll see at rebuttal.
Sure.
I think now.
Could I ask the architect a question?
Yes, please.
I, too, am a LEED accredited professional. So my question is LEED, and in your calculations for your points in parking, did you consider a van at all in part of that when you were thinking of your calculations?
That's a good question. LEED for homes, let me restart that. While LEED for new construction gives you points for providing such things, I believe LEED for homes does not. There were other things that we were considering, though, that I tried on successfully on another project on the west side, which was providing dedicated outlets for electric vehicles at a number of parking spaces. The thing is that it would be, I think, difficult to justify something like that on a project like this because, going back to the parking issue, there are two things that make that lower the parking count, the actual parking count on affordable housing projects. One is that simply tenants cannot afford the number of vehicles that can be afforded by someone paying a market rate apartment. But the other one is proximity to mass transit. But to think that someone can afford a fancy electric vehicle that they can plug into the wall is probably a little far-fetched. But we would be open to. I'm always open to
I was just curious. I know it is sometimes considered an option, and
yes, and we have actually a project that is right now, two projects in Anaheim with the same developer where we have provided a shuttle. The project is substantially larger than this, and it was not required, but we did it out of the interest that we have in that subject.
thank you.
Mr. Lee?
Yes. I have a question on your parking design. Obviously, my question has been directed towards parking, and I'm concerned because of it is an impacted area, and because of the affordable housing that's going up, that is going to affect the neighborhood and potentially impact the street parking as well. I was looking at your design. Have you ever considered designing tandem parking?
Yes, we have considered that, and we had it at one point. The problem with tandem parking is that you can only assign the tandem parking spaces to people who own two cars, two parking spaces. Otherwise, we can't say one parking space is for you and the next one is for your tenant. I mean, for your guest.
I understand
that's impossible to do.
The next follow-up question is that I know you allow 2 parking spaces for 2 bedrooms. How many parking spaces have you allowed for 3-bedroom and 4-bedroom?
I'm going to defer that question to Rodney, to Khan.
The reason I'm asking is that you have 9 units of 3-bedroom and 9 units of a 4-bedroom.
Yes.
Which I am assuming that those members will have more than one car, even though your justification for reduction of a parking is that they have less cars than normal people.
The bottom line is this: right now, the way our parking design, and this is maybe our 6th iteration of the parking lot design. We have constraints because of the small site and because we're trying to keep the the subterranean parking really subterranean, and we don't like to see projects where the parking where you're driving down the street and you're looking at a parking structure with apartments on top, and so the ramps, the turning, the structure, all of this is in a tight lot has a severe impact on our layout. We're still continuing to work on the parking, and we will consider tandem parking if it is appropriate. We in fact would favor it because tandem parking reduces the ratio of square footage to parking.
Because looking at your drawing there on the parking, I don't know what the total length of the tandem parking is required right now. So if you look at 10 through 15, and let's say 22 through 27, you have 11 spaces there. Maybe if you lose 21 and 16, and then 26, 28, 29, those 5 spaces are gone, I think you have enough spaces there where those things can extend out and gain 11 spaces. Those gaining about 6 more parking spaces. This is a rough calculation, so I don't know if that's something that you can go back and take a look at, because I am concerned about the amount of parking spaces.
Right.
Even though there was a demand analysis done and all that, I'm not questioning that at all. But more parking you can provide, it'll help to ease.
It would really help if the public had use of these parking spaces, but it won't help within our building because, again, to go back to the parking study and many parking studies that I've seen over all my years in this kind of business, those spaces will go unused, largely unused.
Meaning the tandem spaces?
No, any more parking spaces in the ratio that we have. If we were to provide, 70 or 80 or 90 parking spaces, I guarantee you that anything above, 50 something. I mean, there is really no magical number, but in my experience, even with parking reduction in any existing operating affordable housing projects with parking reduction, we end up with anywhere between 50 to 70% usage of those parking spaces, and these are hard statistics that come from management. Most affordable housing projects have an on-site manager, as will this project, and so it will be very easy to measure that, and it's the same on the other projects that ADI has done in the city, and all the countless projects I've done throughout Southern California.
So your point is that the parking requirements within the project will not be an issue; they'll be adequate. But the real issue is people outside of the project
and
won't have parking spaces.
Exactly. Whether we provide more or less parking spaces for our building, it will not alleviate the impact for the neighbors. However, something that should be noted is that currently in the width of our lot, there are 3 driveways going in. These driveways create, sort of smaller spaces in between the driveways where it's difficult to park, and obviously you can't block the driveways to park, not legally anyway. With our project, we're going to take away 2 of those driveways, increasing the availability of on-street parking. And you can.
That was a progressive thing to bring up.
Well, I mean, that's what it is. It's not something that we did on purpose. That's just what it is.
Yeah, but it's nice to point out, by the way, neighborhood, you're gaining 2 spaces.
Yeah.
Fight for them.
It may be 3 actually, but anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Is it intended that these spaces be assigned, or are they just randomly first come, first serve?
I would defer that question to the owner.
Do you happen to know, Mr. Khan? Operationally, they're assigned spaces. Okay. Any other questions for the architect? Or at this time, the applicant?
Is the guest parking in with all the other parking?
Yes, there is no separation designed at this time, but keep in mind that at the moment, we're at a very conceptual stage, and that's something that we always look at, and we often designate parking spaces. In larger projects, we separate guest parking physically from the rest of the parking lot. Smaller projects, it would be simply signage issue.
The idea would be the guest parking would be underground.
Yes.
With the, I guess,
underground and more than likely the first few spaces,
Right.
just like we have the first few spaces that are accessible as
Next to the
our
handicap.
handicap parking spaces.
And so since you have to access the live work from the outside.
You don't have to, but
you go through inside the building. And
there's 2 ways to access what you see in that middle drawing that shows the first floor. The units that are number 15 through 18 facing Salem are the ones that are the live work. There are, again, 2 ways to access them. You can access them directly from the street, and you can see that in that sort of middle roof site plan rendering, the one that says roof plan. You can see 4 walkways leading up into the units. That's direct street access into the live work units. You can also park underground, go up the elevator, and then go into the courtyard and the units.
Is this all going to be open? Is this an open?
Yes, it
this
is.
Open to the case?
Yes.
So there's no gate or anything, so people can just.
No, there will be a
Further back,
gate
there's a fence.
that is set further back.
This
If you
one?
look at exactly right, that's an elevated walkway, and below that walkway is the security fence that separates the more public from the more private outdoor areas.
And these would be the live work right here. Is
Yes,
that right?
that's correct.
Just another operational question, and because it kind of relates again to parking control and intensity. Is there a resident manager operationally? Thank
Yes.
you. You're not at the mic, so the answer was yes, there is.
Yes.
Thank you. Anything else at this time for the applicant or the architect? No, not at this time. You'll have a rebuttal period shortly. We'll entertain the public portion of the conversation from interested parties. I'm going to start, I think, with there's someone from housing here. There was. Is that gentleman here? If you could just step forward, and I'll find your card eventually.
Right. Good evening. My name is Mike Forney. I'm the housing project manager. And actually, I filled out the speaker card. I just wanted to make an announcement that there'll be a joint public hearing. It's been tentatively scheduled for the City Council and Housing Authority on March 16th. The meeting will be to consider for the Housing Authority a letter of loan commitment and for the city disposition of the city-owned property. I just wanted to make that announcement.
And again, what was the date of that and the time?
It's March 16th of this year, and it's a joint public hearing, so it typically starts at 2:30 in the afternoon.
Okay.
And of course, I'm also here to answer any questions on behalf of Community Redevelopment and Housing.
Okay, so live work, I have a question.
Okay.
Live work, new concept, at least for this neighborhood. What have you been thinking in terms of controls?
Well, we that is definitely something that we want to work out, but I think there's a question of whether or not there'll be covenants recorded. In fact, there'll be covenants, affordability covenants for 55 years on all of the units. So it's something that we need to speak with Mike Racine, the city attorney's office about, but I think covenants going above and beyond the affordability on those four units, which would would further detail their use. I think that's appropriate. So, but it is something that we've been working out.
But you don't have anything set in place. You don't have suggestions. I mean, give us an idea of where you're thinking right now.
Well, to be honest, there's a couple of things that came up that I hadn't really thought about before. So I think they're very good points. That's the hours of use really isn't something that we've really talked about yet with respect to the work. You mentioned the idea of tattooing, I guess, going on.
Artist.
Right, yeah. And, I can tell you internally, when we think of artists, we'd like to be a little bit more specific than that. But whether it be performing artist or whether it be, maybe the art that you think more often of painting and things of that sort. I think we would like to be a little bit more specific, but we really haven't narrowed it down to really that specifically yet.
Well, I guess I get a little concerned in terms of the idea then that there's so much in flux, and depending on how we approve this for live work, we're putting a lot of faith in the hands of a group of people that really haven't thought through it yet. So how do we come back and make sure that there were satisfactory controls?
Yeah, what's important for us in redevelopment housing, absolutely, is the affordability restrictions on those 36 units. And that's something that we've done so often that we're very comfortable in doing that. But and I think probably I would defer to that to Mr. Garcia with respect to how you guys feel comfort-wise with how far we've thought through the live-work units, their use.
Who oversees the housing authority within the city?
Well, it's the housing authority, which is the city council plus 2 tenant commissioners.
Okay, but who's the head of the housing authority then?
You're talking about the chair of the housing authority?
Yeah, I guess it's probably acting right now. No, in terms of in terms
Well,
of,
in-
on a
in staff-
day-to-day basis, staff, thank you.
Yeah, I apologize. Okay. Phil Lonsfame, or Lonsfame, I apologize, is the Director of Community Redevelopment and Housing.
Okay, so if we were trying to, let's say, direct it to a particular staff member for final, that's what I was searching for.
Yeah, exactly right. That would be where you go.
Questions for the gentleman from Housing?
Mr. Chair,
Please.
can we hear what the, I guess, the categories that in the San Fernando zone?
Yes.
He was
Yes.
able to
Are
find
you
that?
ready, Mr. Pagani?
Yes, I am.
Thank you, Mr.
The question was, what are some of the examples? And I actually had to go back and look at some of our notes from that point of how we got to this. If you were to define live work for, say, artists' use only, that's not how it has ever been defined in the list of the uses in the code. What we did, for example, we were looking at post-production, pre-production, animation as types of arts, the types of arts that we wanted to attract there and that would actually be trades as well that people could make money of. So in that sense, we kind of made them generic uses and we listed them under computer services and or office uses. So we actually avoided listing out what we might consider arts-related uses very specifically. And if that is the intention of the Planning Commission, then I would retract what I said to limit them to this list of uses that are permitted in the SFMU, because they may say something like office use or general office use, and then underneath it we may have listed some of these uses. If you would like to limit them further, then I would recommend that you give some direction to the Housing Authority as to the extent that you would like to limit the impacts on the other residents in the community and in the units or in the building, and then maybe ask the Housing Authority to further refine the list of the users that could be considered artist users in this particular project, because that would be the best way to get to it, and the code does not do that.
I might add.
Please, Mr. Sheets.
If I might add to Hassan's statements, I'll pass this around, but Mr. Foy handed me some definitions, and I just quickly looking at it, I noticed some possible conflicts regarding what type of work in a work use can be done on the ground floor, facing the boulevard or the street. In addition to that, there were some types of work that may or may not be appropriate, but at this point we don't know whether it's just artist or what type of artist, so that is really unclear. And I also noticed that some of the uses that we discussed this evening might require a conditional use permit. There might be others that would require a conditional use permit, and I guess my point is, I don't know what they are. So I don't know what I would be discussing or allowing or approving.
That particular distinction is made in the code because live work units for conditionally permitted uses is listed as a separate live work type. So we would not recommend a live work combination that includes conditionally permitted uses. We would only recommend things that are flat out permitted.
So we need to know what those were.
Right, and those are very specifically called out in the code. For example, sales of alcohol or certain types of personal uses do require conditional use permits.
So it could be a live work wine bar.
That's right.
Okay. I'm a little concerned. I'm sorry, you done, Mr. Sheets?
Yes.
I'm a little concerned over the idea that you were kind of pulling in, let's say, computer uses, because I know from experience with live work, they'll cram 6 or 8 computers in there, and suddenly your live workspace, again, working with India, working internationally, working with artist hours and computer people's hours, they're 24/7, and you could be in there with 6 or 7 computers. Again, intensification of use, intensification of time, and intensification of parking.
That's a fair concern. I think it would be really appropriate for the Planning Commission, for example, to impose a condition on the number of employees that could be hired, say, no more than one in addition to the resident at any given time, where you could even add restricted hours to the hours of work that they can perform. Those are definitely within your purview.
Okay, no other questions, I guess, for that speaker, as it turned out. We've kind of gone afield. Next speaker card I have is Hovik Haganian. And I'm sure I've continued my long habit of mispronouncing names, so if you could correct me. Hovik, thank you. And how did I do on the last name?
Agayan.
Yeah, I was wrong on that as well. All right, thank you, sir.
Good evening. My name is Hovik Agayan. I'm an architect in City of Glendale. I'm a real estate investor and developer. Coming to this project, I think, as my personal opinion, it's a disaster. This project is a disaster for that location. Maybe if you take this project and put him somewhere else, more open space, maybe it's a perfect project. But coming to this specific at this location, it's a disaster. First of all, eliminating 34 public parking. Second, reducing the amount of the parking with the standard for zoning from 99 to 81, from 81 to 58. I don't believe when we have live-in work apartments, I call it apartments, one-bedroom apartments, facing to the Salem, and the architect says, oh, we are extending the parking for more because we are closing the driveways. If I'm an artist and I have a customer coming to my artwork, he's going to park right in front of me. It means those 4 parking spaces that are taking credit for that one, it's gone. And meantime, in their spaces, and I noticed some design, because I didn't follow the design of the project, I noticed there's an additional open spaces required when you're going over 22, goes to 27, now it goes to 36. There's an additional spaces required by the zoning that you have to provide. I noticed there's only 1,900 square foot additional open space. Actually, that 1,900 should be 3,100 additional open space. The most important thing, I own a property across the street in the same street. That's a street, substandard street. Because when you cross the Columbus, the street, the same street, Salem Street, they reduced the width of the parkways from 5 to 3, and they permitted to park both sides. In Salem, in between Central and Columbus, there's park only one side. And you know all the 50 linear foot lots and one driveway, sometimes there's impossible to park 2 parking in between whatever left in between the lots, with 30 foot or 35 foot. That's why I was recommending to the public work department and the engineering department to eliminate those 5-foot parkways to 3 foot, make it the same as the west side of the Columbus, let the people park on both sides. Second, I'm asking the architect, I'm recommending to architect to go back and calculate the open spaces. Meantime, redesign the parking because it's easy to have minimum 81 parking in the same structure.
Thank you very much, sir. Questions for the speaker? Seeing none. Just as an aside, and I probably should have made this clear, because of the large number of speaker cards, I'm going to ask people to limit their remarks for 3 minutes, and if it happens to be concise or whatever, we'll obviously allow a certain amount of discretion to that. Also, I would just like to point out, I realize there's a lot of concerns in the community. Please recognize the relatively narrow task that is in front of us, and that is basically whether or not to allow a live-work process within the scope of this project. Again, I'll allow a lot of discretion because I know a lot of people have concerns on the project, but that really is the matter in front of us. Next speaker card I have is Sandy, and I'm going to blame your handwriting. So if you can come forward and correct me. I'm sorry?
My name is Sandy Mitadero.
Thank you.
What I wanted to know, if there was a report or a study that was done for live-work units or affordable housing in regards to the property values. I just wanted to know if there was a published study on how this type of complex would affect the property values in the area.
Staff? Are you aware of anything?
No, we did not do such a specific study. And,
No, but somebody might have, Cal Berkeley or someone like that might have created something. Not to infer, it could have been Stanford. But
or UCLA.
That's what I wanted to know.
I would also ask Mr. Khan if you'd talk with your clients just to see if they're aware of that. It was so. Just to repeat, there was nothing that the city did in the process of the negative deck or the processing of this application. Correct.
Correct.
All right. Thank you very much. Next speaker card is Richard Espiritu.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, and staff. I am Richard Espiritu. I was here this morning, and I have no objection to this project, even the Live Work program for affordable housing project. However, this morning I sat here and listened through a litany of departments that chimed in on this project. And unfortunately, after listening to this litany, I missed one. And I'm probably going to shoot some of the people in the foot, because I'm going to refer to the Public Housing Administration Reform Initiative of September 14th, 2007. Like ADA, there's been a lot of clarifications, and most of the time with the Americans with Disability, this had to go through court jurisdictions. However, this initiative was a clarification of 24 CFR 964. Basically, what this initiative did, and I'm going to leave the staff a copy, and I hope every member of this commission get this, because I am in favor of affordable housing projects. Public housing, residential, there should be a residential council of affordable housing projects, and the Public Housing Authority, as of, and this was because of HUD, as of March 1st of 2008, recommended that all public housing authorities establish these residential affordable housing councils. Unfortunately, there is only one residential affordable housing council here in the city of Glendale at this time. And I contacted them because I am working with them very closely on other projects. And I would like to know why the city hasn't established this organization. And there is a program, it's called Hope 6, that has already established funding for this program. And it's made up of residents. And the way I understand everybody hearing today, a lot of this program, and I'm going to leave a copy, and I hope every one of you commissioners read this, because I hate to be coming back every time there's affordable housing project on this, because this is something that creates a situation where people who have affordable housing have the ability to make an input into the project from the conception stage. I am also going to leave a copy of this with Mr. Khan and the developer, because I hope they will take the initiative to go ahead and do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Next speaker card is Barry Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commission and staff. I'm Barry Allen with Vanguardians. I was certainly understood that this was going to be about a particular use variance, but earlier in your comments and so much was made about so many issues were brought up regarding traffic or regarding parking that I think it's an open field. But basically, you're being asked to make a decision on a use variance on a policy that hasn't even been developed on the live work. We don't know how many people, we don't know how many vendors, how many customers, how many employees that these live work will have. And you're asked to be able to make a decision on that. It's like molding dry sand. And you know you really can't mold dry sand. You also had this morning a zoning officer's hearing and regarding the same project, and you don't have the input from that. You know, we had the same project being heard twice the same day, and each is in a vacuum. At least, Chair Kane, you had the interest to really ask about some of those questions that occurred. But you're left in a dilemma. And I think your best issue with dealing with this dilemma is to say, after March 16th, after the Housing Authority and the Council come back with some policies, then maybe we can actually deliberate on this particular issue. Thank you. I'm Barry Allen.
Thank you. Next speaker card I have is Eric McConian.
Council. You know,
your name, please, for the record.
My name is Eric McCanion. We own the property at 229 North Central. It's faces on Central, and our parking runs a distance of runs along the alley between California and Salem. Mr. Khan is great. He's great at selling the idea of affordable housing and using phrases and so forth like LEED certified, or should I say LEED certified, and so forth. Regardless of how green this project is, we still are losing public parking, and that's the biggest issue in the area. I'm amazed that this is even being put through. Anyways, he further backs up the claims by utilizing a study that doesn't even include any of the parking areas adjacent to the city lot. Mr. Khan acknowledges the encroachment issues and offers no alternative in that. I spoke with Mr. Kraus yesterday in regards to in the encroachment issues and so forth in the neighboring lots, and it was the first that he'd heard of it. The traffic consultant that was used in the lot, or to figure out the calculation, the 16% and so forth of usage, it doesn't really. They're comparing it to like the lot behind Porto's. The use over there is quadruple. This lot has been in the community for a long time, was set aside in the heart of Glendale, right off of Central. It's not the same, I mean, it's right off of Central Avenue, to provide parking for the businesses and residents in the area, not to be taken away by developers in 2010. The loss of the parking lot 12 would be a hardship to the tenants at 229 North Central and their customers and the residents in the area and the additional businesses. I ask that we keep lot 12 and look to the future. The Glendale City lot and the private lots are all lined up and would make a great future project that would dwarf the proposed project in size. There are only 3 property owners on Central, and all parking lots are unimproved at this time. Please do not sell the city's piece of this pie at this time.
Yes, sir. Next speaker card is Seda Aghanian. Yesterday, I had one in a row.
Hi. Good evening. My name is Seda Agayan. I'm a real estate investor and property manager. My office address is 100 West Broadway, Suite 950 in Glendale. The Agayan Trust owns the property at 338 West Salem Street since 1999. I was in this morning's hearing, and I'm confused because, to me, the first important thing about this project hasn't been resolved, which is the parking issue. I have read the 173 pages of the report that was prepared and was on the website by the staff. And the study that was done on the parking, when I read, I was surprised how you can come to conclusion only doing a survey 2 years ago, one time, for 3 days in one project, conclude that the parking spaces from 81 has to reduce to 67, and then the second justification to bring it to 58, to conveniently meet your requirements is based on that this project is located in an urban area versus the other project that they checked, which is Metropolitan City Lights, and therefore the parking should be reduced more. And since that issue hasn't been resolved, now I'm hearing that we are discussing about live-work units. I was one of the members that was participating with coming with this live-work unit concept and the use and everything else. And I'm thinking if the zoning, the parking issue hasn't been resolved, the live-work issue, I see that there's more unknowns about that one. So I don't know what's the rush, And I will recommend that if the staff believes that the affordable housing in Glendale, the parking requirements are very, it's under, it's too much and they don't use it, why we're not having other work sessions and come with new codes so we know that affordable housing in Glendale needs 42%, because that's the reduction they're requesting, 41% reduction, needs 41% less parking requirement. So everybody knows, so nobody's time is wasted. Whoever comes with affordable housing project knows how many parking they need. So I thank for your time.
Thank you. Next speaker card is Michael Bayo, I'm going to guess.
I'm giving my...
Great. Moving along. Thank you, sir. Chris Tawa, I'm going to guess.
Good evening. My name is Chris Taga, and I just want to thank the Commission for going over the parking issue, because that's a major concern in the neighborhood. I live at 361 Salem. I'm also the president of the HOA there, and parking has been a problem. I'd like to address the work, live, artists concept that they have. As a former hazardous materials inspector for the Los Angeles City Fire Department, and depending on the type of artist, artists pollute, whether it's liquid, solid, or air pollutants. And I know that the Commission is going to further research that area, but I would recommend that they also consult with the Cal EPA, Department of Toxic Substance Control, as to the type of work that should go on there, if it's approved. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I don't have any other speaker cards. Before we get into the rebuttal period, were there any other further remarks from staff as it relates to presentation?
I don't have anything to add at this time.
All right, we'll begin rebuttal period.
Thank you once again, Rodney Kahn. The first speaker said that this location is a disaster. I couldn't disagree with him more. I think it's an excellent location. I think there was a variety of reasons that I initially gave, and I still feel very, very strongly about it. This is an excellent location for this project. The parking is a problem on the street, and we keep coming back to the parking. I know we're kind of not supposed to talk about it, but maybe we are, and kind of relate it to live work the best we can. There's a parking problem out there on the street. We fully acknowledge that. But we are not going to be adding to it. It is an existing condition. It's not something that we can correct or resolve. But once again, we're not adding to it. As it relates to a published study for live work clients on property values, we don't have that, but we could see if we can dig something up. That was brought up as a comment, and we'd be happy to do that. The one gentleman talked about the traffic consultant that spoke at the hearing this morning. It wasn't a traffic consultant. It was the city's traffic engineer. It was Tom Mitchell, Assistant Traffic and Transportation Administrator. has nothing to do with our team. It has to do with the city and his analysis and his discussion, and very clearly talked about the parking, very clearly talked about the traffic in the area. The one lady brought up, if parking requirements are too onerous, a study should be done to reduce parking for affordable housing. I couldn't agree with her more. I think if that's something the city could do, we should absolutely do it. I think we've proven or we've shown and discussed that that's the direction we should go in. We should further analyze that. We'd be happy to participate in there, give data, and do everything else. Couldn't agree more. The one gentleman about artists pollute, I don't think that's a slogan the artists would want to use, but nevertheless, if it's something that is a concern, we will certainly deal with that and address it as well. Anyway, that's what I heard. Those are my remarks. Thank you for your consideration.
Questions for the speaker?
I have one.
Certainly, Ms. Landrigan.
Mr. Kahn, when Mr. Kraus said that the 34 public parking spaces were only 16% used, and that leaves about 6 parking spaces that may have been used regularly daily, calculation for you. Was that ever, when you lose public parking spaces like that, when you do a project like this, is that ever included in the calculations for parking?
Into our calculations?
Well, it wasn't mitigated in the EIR, and it wasn't indicated as needing to be mitigated, so I'm bringing it up. Would you say that that's true or not? Should it be mitigated if you're losing public parking spaces?
It should be mitigated if it has a significant environmental impact. If it doesn't, no, it should not. And the conclusion was it did not. And the conclusion was not done by our consultant. Mm-hmm. The conclusion was done by the city traffic and transportation section that oversees the public parking lots.
But if that had been included in the CEQA document, you would have been more than willing to comply with the requirement to mitigate that loss.
It matters what the requirement was.
Well, if there's a loss of 5 parking spaces to the public through the loss of the city lot, and it is dealt with as a significant impact to the neighborhood, because parking and loss of parking is a significant impact in a lot of ways, and it would say that the density bonus should be mitigated by the fact that there is this net loss, and therefore your reduction would have been different. You would have complied with it, or would you have not?
If there is any significant environmental impact that our project creates, yes, we would have complied with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One quick question, Mr. Kahn. In working on this project, has there ever been a list of artists waiting to use this kind of unit? That you're aware of in the city?
Let me answer that question. First of all, there's 220,000 people in the city of Glendale. And when this concept was discussed with us, once again, as I started out, we do affordable housing. And so what we were looking at was, it's an interesting concept. Is this something that we think that 4 units can be filled in the city of Glendale? Yes, absolutely, no doubt about it with artists.
Okay. I understand.
One speaker brought up the question about open space requirements on that. So is there additional open space that was required on this specific project, or can you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems like you do have a lot of open space. The one you're providing immediately in front of it, is that what you're providing, or is that part of the city? Or is that because you're required to do that?
As it relates to that comment, I don't know how his scale or measurement is.
Right.
So I can't, people kind of throw things out. I'm not sure. He claims that we're deficient in our common open space or additional open space. I don't really know. We think we are not.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a significant amount of open space, as you can see by the courtyard and also by the large outdoor plaza as well.
Yeah. So. And actually, and that's one of my questions, because was there any consideration for parking to be, instead of this green area right here, which is nice, but any consideration for parking to be indented into that area? Maybe the 4 spaces or the 5 spaces that are supposed to be the guest parking for the live work? Was there consideration done for that? I mean, no. It seems like it's like, I don't know the size of that, if it could be possible. But what was the consideration, if at all, if that was done at all?
Just to address that, Commissioner, first of all, that would be in the front setback area. And the code doesn't allow us to park in our front setback area. So that would be discouraged. The second thing is I think the city, as in their codes and ordinances, encourages us to provide landscaping and live plant material in that setback area for aesthetic purposes, along with a number of other things. So it wasn't something that we ever contemplated or discussed, nor would we be encouraged by the city to do that.
Okay.
Recap for me, please, Mr. Khan, why you are going through all this to create live work when you could just have had a two-bedroom.
Really? I'm questioning that myself.
Oh, really?
Jesus. No. We're thinking we're doing something good here.
I'll just feed you the straight lines. Okay. No, really would be good.
Yeah, I mean, what we looked at it and we thought that this is something. First of all, it wasn't a large number of our units that we were looking at. We were looking at 4 out of the 36. Secondly, it was something that we had been strongly encouraged to look at
by the city,
by our city council. Okay, that's why we look at these things and we see if there's opportunities for people to fulfill what it is that their requirements or what they're hoping the direction the city goes in, and we're able to do that, then by all means, let's do it. This is one of those items.
Any other questions? All right, seeing none, we're going to close the public hearing and enter into deliberations. Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to point out what we just handed out in case members of the public are wondering. We handed out copies of Chapter 30.45 of the zoning code, home occupation permits. The reason I just brought copies of this for you is that I think a lot of the questions that you've asked address the issues that have been addressed in this chapter. So in order to allow a person to have a home occupation permit, the zoning administrator usually, or the hearing officer needs to make these findings. You could use those to formulate some conditions if you wish.
Yeah, on cursory review, Mr. Hagani, I mean, this is a starting point, but there's a lot of things in here that fly right in the face of what we're trying to accomplish, or what I think true live work accomplishes. This is for the bookkeeper that maybe wants to do something in his house as a general statement. I mean, you could come up with another 50 occupations, I'm sure. But, for example, one of them is no increase in pedestrian or vehicular traffic should be generated by the occupation. I mean, if it's an artist, there's going to be a little bit of increase in traffic. Let's see. No sales of products on the premise should be permitted. So there's a starting point here, but it's not fully developed.
And I wasn't suggesting that it would really address everything, but for example, J, which was, I, no hazardous process or emission of smoke. Some of the issues have been addressed, not necessarily that you are looking at a home occupation process here.
But if you, looking at that, Mr. Hagani, I think what I'm hearing Mr. Kane say is that if they're artists, they're going to do some of these things. So is that okay or is it not okay?
I'm not suggesting that you actually apply all of these, but some of the topics that you have raised may be addressed through some of these findings, but not necessarily all of them. I agree that an artist would want to sell their art, for example.
Well, yeah, all right. And one question while we're still open, and back to my question to Mr. Khan. In developing this concept, was there an interest or any kind of demand relative to artists taken in consideration, or was it based on the fact that it intuitively is a good idea, based on the direction that the city is going on, that it is something we should do? I mean, was there a specific need or demand?
Well, there is
for
artists. The city council, if you may have noticed that recently has been focused a lot in attracting art-related businesses and activities to the city of Glendale. This would be, I believe, one way to address that.
I understand. Thank you.
So if we put in conditions for this live work, if we do pass this, and then later on, can we add additional conditions if, I mean, we have an ordinance for live work lofts, I guess, for the city, then it would apply to, if this was built, I guess, right? The new conditions would be applied to this.
I think what we're hearing is the current live-work standards are probably more broad than we'd want in an R-1250.
But doesn't that affect just the San Fernando?
Yes, to maybe reiterate the same thing, the current live-work definition applies to the San Fernando Road corridor with a broader set of activities. This is really in a residential zone adjacent to the downtown area. So I think to the extent that the uses spill off of the downtown area activities on Central, you're compatible. But anything that goes way beyond that is probably not appropriate.
I have one question.
Sure.
Mr. Ghani, Mr. Khan referred to a downtown specific plan, and if this was a 50 feet over, that would not be here before us. And in the DSP, that this live-work condition is allowed for the artist. And I'm, puzzled right now. If we have that already, allocation or allowance for this, do we not have a definition of what this is in the DSP?
The definition in the DSP is also more inclusive and broad than what you're looking at. An artist's loft or a live work specific to certain types of arts activity is much more limited than what's included in the downtown specific plan.
Any other questions for staff or the applicant? All right, seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing and again request that we enter deliberations. Is there anyone that would like to go first?
I'll go.
Mr. Lee.
I think this live-work concept is a noble one. I like it. I'm just, bothered by the fact that, there is no really definitive guideline as to what this is. So I think, until we have, we develop, I guess more narrow description of what this is going to be, I will have a little problem of approving this. Now, as far as the need for parking requirements or reduction of parking requirements for affordable housing, I think I addressed this to the staff that I think we need to have also, staff to look into putting a guideline as to what this will be if we have already established all the studies, in this area that, there is a historical data that indicates there's a, reduced requirements, of the parking requirements for affordable housing or senior housing, then I think we need to spell that out for the future. Really depends on what type of artists that will come in. I have a little hard time believing that, allocation of a 1+1 parking for live work, even though we do not have a, clearly we do not know what this is. I'm looking at it as a somewhat commercial application type of a condition here. So I think, I've seen some of this artistic corridor or, the areas in Los Angeles downtown area. And certainly, those areas are visited, not every day or every hour, but, there are times where you do get a load of customers coming through to look at this, the displays of the artists, and, or for any type of meeting. So, that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to really to make any decision because of the we don't know who's going to come in to occupy this live work space. But other than that, I am for the project. I think we need affordable housing, and So, I mean, that's not, we're not here to decide on that. But as, throughout the whole hearing, I did mention that, there is, need to review the parking concessions, parking requirements, and I think some of the speakers here address the same issues here. So I encourage, the architect to revisit to see if there's a way to provide more parking spaces through tandem parking arrangement. And, that I think might address also maybe additional requirements that, in my mind, that might come up as a result of live-work conditions that we're trying to approve here. So I am, right now, I want to listen to other commissioners, and, but I haven't made any mind yet as which direction I'm going to go on the use variance.
Fair enough. Who'd like to go next? Mr. Sheets?
I don't know, go.
Peripherally, that's who I saw move their hand first.
I saw him too.
Okay. Good. I hate to have any dissent on that.
Yeah. It's difficult. Another one of these difficult abstract processes. We heard everything about the whole project again, and now we have to look at one specific area. But I appreciate all the input. I think that was all of the testimony was very clear and very concise. I too have concerns about the parking, but and relative to what we're working on, I think it's important. And I think it's important because we don't know what we're dealing with. We don't know what to call the animal, or we don't know what its variations can be. So I'm not sure if this is going to be an artist area or not be an artist area. I'm not sure if what the usage requirements are. Are we going to use a certain type of business or usage, or are we not? That would impact the parking. Because if it's a certain type of business, there might be 10 customers an hour. If it's another type, it might be 0, depending on whether it's an artist that sells their work elsewhere. There's nothing specific. There's no policy. Don't know what will be allowed to be done. All that I've heard about the project, and I think it's noble, and I can appreciate Mr. Khan's dilemma trying to meet this need. The live-work context, as I'm hearing it, implies artist. I think that's where where it's allowed it to become specific, non-specific and unclear to me. I think the parking will be an issue just for the live work specifically until we do have some more specifics. It'd seem odd to me it would be impossible to stop. It's not going to stop the project just because we can't figure out the issue around live work. But for me to clearly support the live-work concept relative to this whole project, I need to know more. And I think it's important that we look at that right now, because based on the climate we have in our community now, people are creative and will do a lot to be successful and maximize their needs. And if we approve this without going through those gyrations right now, and some person misuses or uses it in a way that we did not define or did not consider, the unintended consequences could be great. And I've also learned in this community that to go back and fix that is extremely difficult, in some cases literally impossible. So I'm listening. I want to hear more input. Right now, I'm looking at an option that will allow us to get more detail, more information about what we're approving, what would occur if this is allowed. So that's where I am right now.
All right. Ms. Landrigan?
Thank you. I am a proponent of work-live environments, and I have to give credit to the applicants for going for this, because thank you for asking us to help you define it, because it needs to be done. I think this is an awkward thing to do, but I think it's a great discussion we have. We've thought about issues that needed to be thought about. in the long run, I think it's going to make the project better for everybody in the neighborhood, including the applicant. And I don't think in any situation is it possible to anticipate what the use is going to be. Whether my next door neighbor decided to put in a skate park and it's not legal, but their kids think it is in their yard. So there are a lot of things you can't anticipate. And so I think we can't anticipate everything here, but I do think that some of the discussions we've had here, and we are here to help the council and advise them on how to make policy, and I think that's what we should take the opportunity to do here. And on that note, I would like to say that one of the issues that seem to be most prevalent to me about the work-live situation are hours of operation and delivery. And those are issues that really need to be addressed very clearly in any work-live situation in the midst of an existing neighborhood. It's not being put in the downtown specific plan, which is less, residentially intensive. So that's a new use in a different zone. So this is an existing zone, and how to make that compatibility happen. I think that the noxious fumes and hazardous materials are addressed in the mitigated negative deck. It says that this will be taken care of, so you couldn't allow it because it says it's not happening. So there are elements within the negative declaration that already will control what the uses are. So I think that is covered. Sounds are another thing. I mean, and the definition of artist, I think that's the hardest element. I would not have a problem with a computer artist. There are a lot of artists. I teach in a school of arts, and so I think that it runs the gamut. You need to be really clear about what the artist can do as opposed to try to define the artist. And that's where I think we should really be careful. We should define what the uses are acceptable, and those artists then comply with that as opposed to trying to define the artist's life. Art redefines itself daily. So I would caution us against that. And the amount of employees that whatever is in that work situation. And also, and sometimes in home occupations, not necessarily here, the amount of deliveries that you can have are limited. You can require that deliveries only occur twice a day. If it's a FedEx truck, you can't deliver, emergency packages all the time. That would impact the neighborhood, especially the parking. And lastly, I think that the covenants that would be put upon this could address all of those. And I think they should, and I think it's an opportunity that we need to embrace and go forward with. It's awkward. It's always hard to do new things. And you're not always going to do them right first, but you got to try, and then you can go back and fix them. And I think this is something that if we take the best step forward and try to define it, and then if that doesn't work, then we revise it. Lastly, I would like to say in the environmental impact mitigated negative deck, which is not an environmental impact report, it looks to me that in that traffic study, there was no discussion of the removal of that parking lot and the loss of that parking to the neighborhood as a whole. That, to me, seems to be an oversight in the preparation of the negative declaration. So those are my comments.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. The project I'm very impressed by, and I like the component of the live work, and I think that's very impressive. And I think also a lot of people on the city council have, the general direction or the vision has been to incorporate more live work lofts or this type of style housing in Glendale. Obviously, the policy, there isn't a really very concrete policy yet, and I wish there is, so we can base it off of that. And I wish there was some more precedent, and I wanted to hear some more examples of maybe some ways we have incorporated it in before. And I think the San Fernando area, because has been more of a testing ground on developing that type of policy. Downtown Glendale definitely lacks that type of housing and the live-work component of it. Although I think it's it's to the benefit of downtown to have something like that, because of just, and I think it's been also in general of the council's direction too, on finding ways to incorporate something like that. And the lack of a policy definitely affects that. And then the lack of a definition of it definitely affects that too. And I would strongly like to see more of a definition of what live work, of what this artist can use it for. And I think once we have that more, we would have a better understanding, and future commissions and decisions and the council can have a better understanding going forward. With that said, I also agree with what Commissioner Landrigan says, that as far as we can't always predict, the uses, even if we have, we don't have complete strict definitions of what we want. We can't always predict what we want, but we do it, and sometimes I guess we. I guess my point is that we have to base it. Sometimes we have to make the precedents, and even if it doesn't, if it's not there right now, then we're hoping that at least for this, for such a small start, since it's only 4 live-work units, that this might set a precedent for later. And if a new policy is being developed and looked at, then the conditions, which if we can set some conditions to, where other commissioners talked about, as far as the time and the type of uses we want, that if a new policy is being developed, then this could be maybe a guinea pig and looked at as far as something new that's happening, especially because it's such a small component of the project. Obviously, parking is also a major concern, and I wish that there was more consideration that was done as far as the parking placement and as far as also on the front of the building as well. So, but with those things said, I think I would be supportive of a live-work condition for these 4 units, since that's what we're approving right now. And I would want to do that with the conditions as far as the timing goes of when it's operated. And if there's enough support for that, we can discuss on what the timing would be for that, and also maybe some restrictions on the type of live-work lofts we can exactly use. For example, like eliminating maybe like a tattoo parlor, which I don't think would be in the benefit of the property owner if he, to have something like that as well. I think it's the benefit of the property owner to have, live-work lofts and artists who would actually be beneficial for the property owner and to the area. And I think it would help out everybody, and it would be into their interest as well as the community.
All right, thank you. Well, first off, I'm satisfied. A lot of our conversation today has been around parking. And I'm satisfied just from the testimony of the applicant that in terms of whether it's live-work or in an apartment, it's parking neutral. The other discussions, that was dealt with in front of the zoning hearing officers earlier today. It's not in front of us. So just in terms of parking, that falls off the table for me. There are parking issues out there, but it doesn't have anything to do about whether we permit live work or not. However, you also brought up, and it was quite appropriate that you brought up San Fernando Corridor, because what's happened through the years is live work has become a way of redeveloping industrial manufacturing parts of a city that have fallen vacant or in disrepair. It's a way of recreating life in an area that's dead. We're taking an idea, I think philosophical, we all like the idea of live work, we're all, pro-affordable housing, all that type of stuff. But now we're taking an idea that was used to revitalize industrial manufacturing facilities, and now we're taking it and putting it into a residential environment. And is that the right thing to do? Well, if we sit here, and there's maybe 50 of us in the room, we have 50 different ideas of what could be permitted and what could not be, just simplistically. A grandmother knitting shawls isn't going to bother anybody. So some of us have a soft vision of what that would be, and then there's the rest of us that think that, it'll be infested by head-banging tattoo parlor people or, whatever, whoever we want to basically slur, whether it's justified or not. So the problem we have is philosophically, live work, sure, sounds great. It's parking neutral based on testimony. The problem is that who goes into that live work is just not defined. And we as a commission sitting up here could hit 5 or 6 items tonight. We could spend another hour or 2 hours coming up with more conditions and more control. I mean, some of it was hit upon. The hours of delivery, the hours of operation, the number of occupants, covenants that would be required of the applicant. I thought about an annual inspection required by the fire department, since we all know artists love things that burn. There's just, and that's just like 5 or 6 things we came up with in the course of this testimony. So, as potentially desirable as live work is, without knowing who's going to go in, frankly, you as the applicant have some concerns. I mean, depending on how smart we all are in a short process, you could be opening up a can of worms that you can't control. So I don't necessarily want to say that live work should disappear from the project. It could, maybe you can have it remain in as you do your pro formas and seek your funding. It could be kind of a flex thing, but there's no way that, from my view, that as a commission or as a planning agency, we're ready to figure out any of the conditions that should go into live work in a residential area. I'm also thinking it's kind of bad planning, unless you want it to happen, to have the commercial corridor of Central Avenue start sliding down onto Columbus, unless that's a long-term, planning idea to suddenly have Columbus become kind of a light commercial type of street. I'm not sure that's really where the planning department wants to go. All that said is we could continue this to a date certain. We could continue this to a date uncertain. We can deny it. We have some options there. I would like to reopen the public hearing to just hear a little bit from the planning department and, for that matter, the applicant in terms of whether we go for deny, continue to date certain, and so on, if that's all right with my fellow commissioners. Okay, we're reopened. Let's start with the Mr. Hagani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. With regard to the options that you just listed, the staff would recommend that if you're not prepared to make a decision tonight in terms of a conditional approval of a variance, we recommend that you deny it. And I can tell you why. The reason is that this project is subject to a very strict deadline in order to apply for potential financing. So it would be better for us to just recommend to take a denial to the Housing Authority.
So that we don't keep them in limbo.
Exactly.
All right. Mr. Khan, would you approach, please? Comments, sir?
With all due respect, I agree 100% with Mr. Hagani. If you can't make the findings this evening, it would help us the best to move forward with this project to simply deny it. That gives us the opportunity to appeal it to the City Council.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Thank
you, sir. We'll reclose the public hearing. On the basis of those comments, further comments from my commissioners, fellow commissioners. Seeing none, shall we have a motion to deny the application? Or actually the variance? Same thing.
Actually, I like to, I've heard enough, and I don't think, the concerns that I find, even though I have certain concerns, do not outweigh the benefits that we could receive from going forward with this. I think it is a noble idea, so I'd like to move to approve this use variance.
Okay. Well, hold on. Okay. So we have a motion to approve, and I suspect you would entertain conditions if there's a second.
Yes.
Is there a potential, I'm not going to call for it, is there a potential second to the motion?
Yes.
There is a potential second. Okay. So just for pro forma, you're going to make a motion, you'll welcome friendly amendments, and then let's do a second, we can continue the discussion.
Yeah, there's actually attachment 6 that goes with this motion, use variance case number PVAR 2009-047.
On the draft
findings. And it is well spelled out for A, B, C, D, 4 conditions. I'd like to use that as a part of the approval conditions. And then in the list of the conditions, we have specified some of the concerns, some of the hours of operation, and so on, and definition of some of these things. And delivery hours and all that. So I'd like to include those things into the conditions for this approval.
Which one? Where are you talking about? These conditions?
Yeah, there's a condition, and then there's also draft in the back, very back of the package.
Thanks.
Mr. Chair, may I clarify?
I think you can, actually, please.
I would like to offer a friendly amendment that would include the following conditions. That the housing authority would covenant these items, hours of operation and delivery to be within the hours of 8 and 5 p.m. Noxious fumes and hazardous materials are to be in compliance with the mitigated negative declaration. Any hazardous materials need to be visibly posted if they are approved and they are safe within that area. That employees be limited to one outside of the live person. That sounds be limited to the normal sounds of operation, so that large, long, musical possibilities are not there. I don't know how to phrase that, but
Do we not have a noise ordinance
we have that the noise ordinance be
according to the residential?
in the residential area. Those are the ones I would propose.
So let me repeat this since I'm the one that was introducing this here. So I guess in addition to the 15 conditions, I guess we'll add onto the condition that the housing authority enter into a covenant with the client for the hours of operation and delivery, and 4 hours of operation from 8 to 5, and toxic and hazardous material compliance with the negative declaration in the EIR, and hazardous material, if there's any, clearly identified and posted on site, and number of employee to be 1, and any noise, noise level to comply with the residential ordinances.
I might interject that if you're going to build conditions, and I think regardless, I may be on the losing end of a motion, but we'll see how it continues to evolve, is because right now, in the space of 2.5 hours, we're trying to legislate an entire use that nobody's thought through. Mm-hmm. At the very least, put in additional conditions as may be required by the housing authority or the planning department.
Yes. Okay.
Because that'll give them some time to actually come up with some ideas.
Nice.
And I'm a little uncomfortable, frankly, relying on the housing authority, but I'm more comfortable, maybe it's just because I see them all the time, I'm more comfortable with the role of the planning department. Or, I'm sorry, what's the new title?
Community Planning Department.
The Community Planning Department. Okay. So, I mean, I might be swayed if I know that we have truth, justice, and the American way on the part of the Community Planning Department overlooking this, because the 5 of us sitting here in an hour and a half, we're not coming close to covering what we should. And frankly, as a stakeholder, the developer of this property is going to want to have some restrictions that haven't even thought about.
Correct.
Tattoo artists or whatever.
So I will enter one more condition here, that any additional conditions that's developed from Housing Authority and Community Planning Department to be imposed on this project.
Did you have something to?
I'd also be okay on the weekend hours to be a little bit longer than 8 to 5, or at least on Saturday or Friday. You guys are okay with at least till 7 or 7:30? It's very minor.
You know what? This is a work in progress, and
Yeah.
I'm thinking 8 to 5 is a little restrictive during the week.
I just threw it out as a.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I would
But
prefer longer.
that among other things, that the
Right.
Housing Authority and Planning, Community Planning Department need to look at hours of operation. In fact, maybe we don't restrict it. We talk about the things that we're
Yeah.
specifically asking them.
They just want, they can amend it later on.
Yeah, so let's not be,
Okay.
let's not talk about the, that there will be hours of operation.
Limited.
And, limited hours of operation that will be recommended or imposed by additional conditions from Housing or Planning Department.
That's great. And I also think that the best way to approach this, since everything evolves, is to say what can't be done as opposed to what is allowed. And just make it real clear, no gymnasiums or whatever, Okay.
Well, and if I may, Mr. Chair, you did recommend that there might be a condition that there's a fire department review of all work spaces yearly. I think that's was a
Given,
thoughtful.
and I would encourage, in the course of the discussion, I would definitely encourage, for his own liability, that the developer want that. Because the last thing he needs is some crazed artist with, a couple hundred gallons of paint thinner, chain smoking in his apartment.
So all these, I guess, conditions we spelled out as best as we can, but I think the catch-all will be that, any additional conditions that will be imposed by, developed by Housing Authority and Community Planning Department will cover some of the ones that we missed here. So the ones that we just mentioned here will become part of the conditions that we just developed. So with that said, so I guess on going back, I guess I got to do this here.
Make a comment.
Oh, please, Mr. Chief.
Before we continue and finish this off, I just want to mention that I'm not in support of the motion we're taking right now, but it's not that I'm not in support of the concept and us moving forward with live work. But if I tag on to what Chairman Kane stated, in 2.5 hours we've come up with some ideas that have given me concern. And even if I go more specific in the items we're adding to the motion, they're not clear to me, and we keep adding to the list. So although the project is on a short time frame, now is the time to fix the problems and be specific, and I'm not so sure that if we just let it go from here that all that's going to happen. I would like to see that, and so I have some concerns about supporting the direction we're going in to get to the same place.
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Regani.
If I may address this, I believe. Let me just reiterate what I'm actually hearing, what is being embedded in the condition, and then let me start by actually apologizing for not giving you an actual model to work from, and this is definitely, its absence is completely noticeable, and we apologize for that. And then I believe what you're giving us direction to do, should you choose to approve this, would be for us to compose some sort of a definition of what this artist live work unit definition for this particular project would be, and to focus on conditions that would eliminate any kind of impacts that would be imposed on the other people who live on this property and the surrounding properties. And we promised that we would deliver on that, and we would come up with a definition and a set of conditions that would attempt to address a lot of what you have raised tonight.
Mr. Chair, just one comment.
Mr. Garcia.
Just with respect to the condition of allowing the Planning Department and the Housing Authority to come up with additional conditions, if this were the typical private project, we wouldn't really be able to give the Planning Department unfettered discretion to come up with conditions. Because this is a a public-private partnership, if you will, I think it's appropriate to allow the housing authority to come up with additional reasonable conditions to protect the public health and safety and welfare. So my request would be to limit that to the housing authority and not to the planning department, because we really couldn't just give the planning department unfettered discretion to impose conditions. Although, in all reality, the conditions that are come up with, I can imagine that the applicant is going to agree to, as long as they're reasonable. And just so that you know, I guess for your purposes of deliberating that point, the executive director and of the housing authority and the city manager are the same person. So, if there are conditions that you want, that the housing authority wants, they're going to get imposed on this project. But we can't have a condition that just gives unfettered discretion to the planning department.
Procedurally, I understand where you're coming from.
Let me just count
And also, just two other points. Just 1 second. I just want the record to be clear. I thought what I heard Mr. Lee saying was that the findings were going to be as stated in Exhibit 6 to the report, the first 15 conditions from Exhibit 1, and then the additional conditions that he stated, or he's going to restate, I think.
That's correct.
Okay.
Mr. Sheets?
And I'll just highlight a point based on Mr. Hergani's input. For me, I think where I was going is I'd like to see that before we give the approval, but that's fine with me. We need to see it so we don't go through this exercise next time live work comes to us. So shortly thereafter, in some fashion, we need to be made aware of that
specific details. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so
Mr. Garcia, have you heard a motion that's complete yet, or do you want Mr. Lee to restate what's going on?
I think it'd probably be easier if you restated it for the record,
Right.
so that the secretary can also record it.
Okay. So I move that upon review and consideration of all materials and exhibits of a current record relative to use variance case number PVAR 2009-047, located at 327 and 331 Salem Street, and city parking lot number 12, and after having conducted a hearing on said matter, that the Planning Commission hereby approves said use variance case number PVAR 2009-047 in accordance with the findings set forth below, and A, B, C, D, actually using the attachment 6 of the draft findings of those A, B, C, D findings, and conditions 1 through 15 plus the following additional conditions: that the fire department inspect the property once a year, and then the additional conditions developed by housing authority, I guess working with the planning department to impose additional conditions, and enter into covenant with the developer to include all these conditions in the covenant, and hours of operations and delivery, toxic and hazardous material compliance with the negative declaration of the EIR, and hazardous material, if there's any, it would be clearly indicated, identified and posted, and employee of 1, and noise level requirement that complies with the residential requirements.
Point of clarification, when you said the property should be inspected by the fire department, you're specifically talking about the live, work, and any related storage units, correct?
Yes.
Searching for a second.
Seconded.
A motion and support. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Commissioner Chits,
No.
Commissioner Yasayan,
Yes.
Commissioner Lee,
Aye.
Commissioner Landrigan,
Aye.
and Chair Kane.
Aye, and a vote to 4-1, the conditional use variance PVA, not a conditional use, it's just a use variance, case PVAR 2009-047 has passed. I'm going to suggest we take a very brief recess, and then we'll continue with the Planning Commission session. So we're in recess for 3 to 5 minutes.
of these? Oh,
We're back.
did you keep the zoning code that I...
All right, we're back in session. This is a continuation of the
No, I passed it over.
February 3rd regular meeting of the Glendale Planning Commission. It's been pointed out to me by Commissioner Lee that in our previous action we failed to acknowledge or certify the negative deck. So I think we need to do something with that.
Well, Mr. Chair, the environmental was approved by the hearing officer who heard the other discretionary entitlements. So if you want, you could acknowledge it. I don't.
Not required? We had a motion in there. That's why it was brought up.
To acknowledge it or to approve it?
Resolution.
I'm sorry? Was it to approve it or to acknowledge it?
It's a resolution of the Planning Commission adopting a mitigated negative
That's
deck.
not required because...
Okay. Great. Then we'll continue on with the next case. It's General Plan Amendment Case PGP 2010-001 and Code Amendment Case PZON 2010-001. The location is citywide, and it's amendments to Titles 12 and 30 of the Glendale Municipal Code, 1995, the Downtown Specific Plan, Town Center Specific Plan, and South Brand Boulevard Specific Plan related to comprehensive changes to the permitting, placement, design, and maintenance of wireless telecommunications facilities in all zones. The recommendation is that the Planning Commission review the proposed amendments related to the wireless telecommunications facilities and provide a recommendation to City Council. Staff is represented by pretty much everyone in the Planning Department. Chris Sassoni, Tim Foy, Howard Malis, and Kristen Asp. And could we get an overview, please?
Good evening, members of the Commission. My name is Christina Sansoni. I'm General Counsel for the Public Works Department, City Attorney's Office, and I'm here to give you a brief review of the ordinance that's under consideration tonight. First of all, there are actually two ordinances. One is an ordinance under Exhibit Tab A, and the second is a smaller ordinance under Exhibit Tab B, which is for the Brand Boulevard Specific Plan, Town Center Specific Plan, and the Downtown Specific Plan. So these ordinances are designed to strengthen the city's requirements for the siting and installation of wireless telecommunications facilities, which I'm going to refer to as WTFs, within zoned property in the city. Since 2005, when the city last looked at regulating WTFs, the city has experienced a significant increase in the number of WTF applications in sensitive zones throughout the city. This increase in WTFs is driven by a change in the industry. With each new generation of cell phone technology, the telecom industry requires more advanced equipment, which provide more bandwidth capacity to handle newer services. The new systems, such as 3G networks, require more coverage and capacity, which must be serviced by much smaller microcell antennas, especially in the hillside areas. There's also been a corresponding rush by the telecommunications services providers to encourage the replacement of landline services with wireless services of all of which requires increased capacity by the providers, and thus an increase in WTFs. The development of wireless telecommunications services are also encouraged by Congress to protect national security and public safety, and thus wireless phones have gained a new prominence on the national scene as a result of the critical role they play during emergencies and in crisis situations. Likewise, there have also been significant changes in the law created by a groundbreaking case called Sprint versus County of San Diego and other cases that have followed. And we'll briefly touch on those cases momentarily. With these changes, City Council found that there was both a need and an opportunity for the city to review and analyze its existing ordinance and the current state of the law, so that as far as legally possible, the city may safeguard residential and other sensitive uses from the intrusion of incompatible and potentially disruptive uses relating to the placement, construction, and modification of wireless telecommunications facilities. We've also, as part of this process, in developing the ordinance, the city staff has investigated all known cellular antenna sites, both by going out in the field, doing spectrum analysis, and also through the city's documentary files, particularly in the city engineer's office. There's a map, one of which is just behind you. The second copy of it is over on the side near the entrance of the chambers here. And this shows all known locations. To date, the inventory shows approximately 110 active sites within or adjacent to the city of Glendale. The adjacent sites have been included to show antennas which may not be sited in Glendale proper, but they have influence over the borderline areas of Glendale. Next, we'll go through a background to show you some of what went into developing this ordinance to date. There's a current moratorium, which I'll discuss momentarily. There are legal constraints, which we will also discuss, the ordinance process, purpose of the proposed ordinance, and certain exempt facilities. First, in the moratorium, on January 13th, 2009, the City Council enacted the moratorium to allow staff sufficient time to develop the ordinance and address the concerns of the public. The moratorium places a hold on all applications for WTFs and related facilities that are in residential zones and public rights-of-way within 1,000 feet of a residential zone. During the moratorium, staff may continue to accept applications, but these applications would be subject to any new standards that may be adopted by the ordinance once it is adopted. Any time limits relative to the processing or action on such permit applications would be suspended during the term of the moratorium. There are a few legal constraints. In this area, we are preempted by both state and federal law for a great extent in regulating wireless telecommunications facilities. We have in the audience Jeffrey Melching, who will come to the podium, and he's going to discuss these legal constraints. Mr. Melching is from the law firm of Rutan and Tucker and is the city's outside legal counsel for telecommunications. Mr. Melching has had extensive experience in litigating telecom cases, including defending ordinances, such as the one that's being proposed for the placement of WTFs. Besides providing the Commission with a brief summary of the legal constraints, he's going to answer questions that you may have throughout this hearing. So I'll leave that to Mr. Melching.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. As Chris indicated, we operate in the telecommunications arena with really three layers of law. There's a federal layer of law. Beneath that, there's a state layer of law. And then there's what we're doing tonight, which is attempting to fashion an ordinance that does something for the city in order to sort of toward the end of advancing your land use goals while also fitting within the constraints of that law. What I'm going to try and do is give you a sense of what those two higher levels of law are currently and what how they've recently changed so that you can understand the need for the new ordinance to some extent. Starting with federal law, basically there's a section of the Federal Telecommunications Act, Section 332, that says that a local agency shall not prohibit or effectively prohibit the dissemination of telecommunications services. The words are simple. The interpretation of those words has been convoluted and complex. Had I come to you before September 11th, 2008, which is the day that the San Diego case was decided that Chris alluded to a couple of moments ago, I would have said, if you have an ordinance that gives you too much discretion, and I can't tell you what that is, only a judge could really tell you that, but if it gives you too much discretion, that then a telecommunications operator could come in without even making an application and say, your ordinance violates the Federal Telecommunications Act because it might prohibit somebody from providing telecommunications services because you might exercise your discretion in a way that was hostile to a telecommunications company. The court, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, in September of 2008, realized that just wasn't working. That regulatory approach to the law wasn't working because it was carving out the ability of local agencies really to advance local interests. So the law switched, and now you're allowed to have some discretion. And in July of 2009, a case out of Anacortes, Washington was released, and in that case, the court clarified exactly how that discretionary process works. And basically what it really said was, if you're going, when a local agency addresses the question whether a regulation prohibits or effectively prohibits telecommunication services, that gets decided on the facts. It becomes incumbent on the telecommunications operator to say, this is how what you're asking me to do won't allow me to provide telecommunication services. And so we moved from the arena where somebody could just look at the ordinance and say that violates my rights to an arena that we're all more familiar with, which is one where an application is put before you, specific conditions are imposed, and an argument, if there is going to be one, arises as to whether those conditions can be complied with. So we're into an environment that's more familiar now. That's the state of the federal law. I should also say that the federal law has been clear all along that aesthetic regulation is really within the scope of your authority. There has been a question about whether under state law aesthetic regulation is within the scope of your authority, and I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer section of this discussion, but to do it now would be a little out of context because those state law requirements apply in the public rights of way, and tonight we're dealing with a zoning ordinance, which is really addressing non-public right-of-way sites. There are a couple of pieces of state law that you should be aware of. One that addresses co-locations. There was a recently adopted provision of the government code that says that where a facility was approved and conditions were imposed through a discretionary process and a CEQA determination was made, actually had to be a negative declaration or an EIR, that if a subsequent applicant came in and wanted to co-locate on the same site, that in that instance, that would have to be a ministerial, not a discretionary approval process, so long as the co-located facility complied with all of the conditions imposed on the original facility. So that's one piece of state law that you should be aware of, and accommodations for that have been drafted into the ordinance before you. And then the second piece is that there is a presumptive minimum duration for permits issued to telecommunications facilities users, and that's 10 years. So we have to articulate a good reason for going below 10 years in terms of a duration for a review of a conditional use permit. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about FCC, the FCC layer of regulations. Some of you may have heard of something that was recently adopted called the shot clock. And the shot clock is very similar, it should be familiar to you, very similar in concept to the Permit Streamlining Act, except for this is something that's been promulgated through the FCC. In general, the mandate from the FCC has been you have to approve a co-located facility within 90 days of a completed application and a new facility within 150 days of a completed application. If you don't, doesn't mean that there's a deemed approval. It means that there's a presumption that you have unreasonably delayed the application, which would then give a telecommunications operator some rights under the Federal Telecommunications Act from a litigation standpoint. You should also know that the FCC is already being challenged on that determination. A case out of the Fifth Circuit, Arlington, Virginia, is taking that up to the Court of Appeals so that the issue can be addressed. There is one other layer of regulation that comes from the federal government side, and I'll let Jonathan Kramer speak to it. In general, this has to do with the extent to which we can consider radio frequency emissions as part of our deliberations on wireless applications.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. I'm Jonathan Kramer. I am a technical advisor to the city. I'm a radio frequency engineer by training. I'm also an attorney specializing in, oddly enough, wireless telecommunications law. The issue that Jeff has just talked about, radio frequency safety, is something that is very important to the public, very near and dear to their hearts. And let me tell you what the law is in this area very briefly. Congress has delegated sole national authority to the FCC to set RF safety limits, the exposure limits, here in the United States. Local governments have no role to play in that at all. We can't even adopt the FCC standards as our own. But what the Commission and Congress allow us to do is to look at a project and determine, will this project comply with the FCC rules? And that's in a very important role, obviously, because we want to ensure that safety layer that is given to us from the federal government. So the ordinance before you tonight also provides for that through a very specific review process. We're allowed to condition projects to ensure compliance with that. That's fairly common. But this is the layer that probably is most controversial to the public because they are very concerned. And I want you to understand we've gone as far as we can in this ordinance without violating the federal law, which we are obligated obviously as a government to follow. With that, I'll turn it back to Jeff, or it goes to Chris. And of course, I'll be here for questions through the process as well.
Thank you. I might note that Mr. Kramer is also the co-author of Exhibit D in your packet, which is a local government official's guide to transmitting antenna RF for mission safety, rules, procedures, and practical guidance. And we use this in our EIR process, our CEQA reviews, as well as in general in developing this ordinance. So moving along, the ordinance process that we are undertaking was initiated back in October when we solicited input from stakeholders from the community as well as from the industry with 3 separate community meetings. We indicated at that time, basically summarized the ordinance and gave folks an opportunity to comment. We also took in comments after those meetings occurred, and they are summarized in Exhibit E in your packet. We've also submitted responses to those comments also in Exhibit E. So following, of course, the presentation of the proposed ordinance to you, the Commission, will be presenting this to, presenting your recommendations to the City Council. The purpose of the ordinance, it's first off to establish preferences for zones, locations, and aesthetics, protect visual character of the community, prescribe clear, reasonable, and predictable criteria in which to assess and process the applications in a consistent and expeditious manner. And this is also to provide the carriers as well as the community with clear standards for what application requirements will need to be submitted. We'll also require, it also allows for orderly and efficient deployment of WTFs in accordance with state and federal law. And finally, providing for a managed citywide development of the WTFs through a multi-tiered process, which we'll discuss in just a moment. Exempt facilities, there are some exempt facilities from this ordinance. They include the amateur radio antennas, satellite dishes, TV antennas, portable radios and devices such as CB radios, government-owned antennas, emergency medical providers, any new equipment for radio, for repair, replacement, or maintenance of existing facilities, but only for that, and broadcast facilities such as television and radio stations. Finally, there may be others. We have a catch-all. Those are exempted by federal and state law. In a summary of the proposed ordinance, we established 2 new permits. One is for the installation of encroachments in the public right-of-way. Others are for the telecommunications facility encroachment permit. I'm sorry, I repeat myself. One is for the rights-of-way and the other is for non-rights-of-way. What we're dealing with tonight in this hearing are for non-rights-of-way, those that are regulated by Title 30. Both of these permits require new application requirements, which are more specified than before. The new application and the new permits rather require specified permits, zones and locations, community notifications, expert reviews when necessary, facility standards and design requirements, safety and monitoring standards, and finally, necessary findings of fact that must be made by the review authority. The proposed ordinance strengthens the city's review powers through more sophisticated application requirements. and it incentivizes carriers to locate in less sensitive commercial, mixed-use, or industrial zones. There are 3 dimensions or main variables that will steer the siting of wireless telecommunications facilities. They are location, where WTF should be sited, aesthetics, what aesthetic design would be most desirable, and the level of review, what decision-making body will be most appropriate for the review. This managed approach was created to discourage less desirable placements and designs of antennas, which would require a higher level of review, as opposed to encouraging more desirable placements and designs by providing lower levels of review. And although this would be a new chapter in the code, the permit requirements and review processes that have actually been modeled from existing permits and processes within Title 30. The format of the new chapter maintains a similar format used throughout the zoning code and for other permits such as CUPs and variances. The ordinance provides for antenna classifications within the non-public right-of-way properties. There are 7 classes, and each class defines a specific type of antenna configuration, which Jonathan will describe for you, and he will describe the type of configuration and what the requirements would be. Jonathan?
Thank you very much. You as planning commissioners, staff, the public, we're all very visual people, so we've decided to show you examples of what the classes would look like or rather than simply describing them in text. And we'll start with Class 1. Class 1 is perhaps the most camouflaged of all of the classes that you'll see tonight. As we've indicated here in the photographs, shown in the photographs, these are mounted on buildings in locations that typically aren't visible to the public. In the case of the church on the left-hand side, they're in the columns there at the very top. The antennas are hidden there. In the case of the other photograph, it's in the cupola on top of the building. So this would be a Class 1, examples of Class 1s. Chris? Class 2. Class 2 it's an interesting catch here because this is a co-location class. For sites that are already out there, we'd see them coming in as Class 2. Co-located on an approved or existing WTF, mounted in the same manner, with the same camouflage. This is a partially camouflaged cell site. And the example here, and this was the best one we could find visually, was to say, if antennas were added to that, it would fall into a Class 2 because it would have the same type of camouflage and the same type of site. This would not allow for going off to the left or the right of the tower, but it would require antenna panels that are consistent with what's there now.
I'm so sorry. Can you go back to Class 1? I missed the picture.
Sure. For Class 1?
Yeah. Okay. Never mind. I just
Okay.
forgot about what it was.
All right.
For a second.
Boy, wait till we get to Class 3.
Well, let's go to Class 3. Good timing. In the wireless industry, there are things called cows and colts and things like that, and they aren't animals, but what they are cell on wheels, cells on light trucks. They're portable cell sites. They're used primarily for providing either temporary replacement service for a cell site that has been damaged, being modified, or to be brought in for a major event where there's just additional coverage. This cell site, this cow, happens to be located at the Rose Bowl. The carriers bring in coverage every year to beef up the coverage at the Rose Bowl for the games, right around the first of the year. So this is an example of Class 3. Class 4, please. Poles and monopoles. Class 4, we have examples here. This is a high school stadium. This is actually out in Agoura. And you see 2 of the 4 light standards here. All 4 light standards at this particular high school have wireless facilities on them. And this is also the same category that monopoles would fall into as well. Monopoles being the more traditional, older style design. Class 5, there we go. Cylinders, flagpoles. In the wireless industry, This is a relatively common technique to hide antennas. The antennas themselves are up at the level of the flag. Sometimes these are designed to not have a flag. We give them a different name. We call them a unipole. But this is a Class 6. It's a cylindrical structure where the antennas are hidden inside the cylindrical element itself. Class 6, building mounted on the side of... mounted on the side, only partially hides or disguises the antennas. Here we use this photograph because you can see an example of a group of antennas that are on two sides of the building there that have been painted to provide a level of camouflage, but it's obviously not a completely camouflaged site. Class 7. Class 7 are, these are specific sites that are built to house antennas. This is, if there's a standalone structure, this would be a Class 7. I chose this particular photograph because I thought it was a particularly unusual and rather clever way of providing a bit of artistic touch to the structure, more than just having a block building. So this would be a Class 7 type of design. Again, a standalone structure. With that, thanks back to you. Unless there are any questions on the photographs that we've had.
Keeping in mind that Class 7, those structures are built solely for the purpose of housing the WTF and for no other purpose. Now, these classifications provide us with just a beginning of the decision-making process, because once an antenna is classified and it starts to go through the decision-making process, it's possible that classifications may change, both by the applicant or working with the aesthetics or the other variables in the decision-making process. What we have before us now is the Permit Review Authority's matrix. This is in the code, and it is a table, table 30.48. Now, this shows how the review process would be accomplished through applications within the city now. The review authority, either the planning director or the planning commission, will review the placement of the facility based on how the facility meets the city's preferred style, zone, and location. For example, the director of planning would be authorized to approve permits in non-residential zones and for temporary Class 3 antennas. This continues the existing system of incentivizing facilities in locations other than residential zones. If the director is not satisfied with the design of the facility in those zones, he or she would have the ability to deny the permit. Now, it should be noted that if a facility exceeds the height limit or is proposed to exceed the height limit, then the request will be considered by the Planning Commission. And in all zones, the Commission would need to determine the additional height as truly necessary before granting approval of the height exception. Applications in a historic overlay zone should be reviewed by, or will be reviewed by, the Historic Preservation Commission. Afterwards, they would be going to the Planning Commission, or in addition to the review authority shown in this matrix.
And the emphasis here is that wherever it's a residential zone or a special recreation zone, it comes before the Planning Commission.
That's correct.
With the exception of the Class 3.
With the exception of the Class 3. Class 2 is a special case because it's co-located. Again, the state law that Mr. Melching mentioned comes into play here. If the base facility already went through a CEQA review, and if it is meets all the other requirements of state law, then a co-located facility on top of that base facility would be approved by a ministerial process.
Can I?
Please.
I guess, what we'll have, a lot of input is a Class 2 and Class 4 as far as aesthetics control from the, the local government level. And Class 2, when you say same as original, I saw the camouflage effect. Do we have control over it as to what to say, what to go, be allowed as what qualifies as camouflage?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Lee, you certainly do. Camouflage is part of the review process. And, the example that was shown, the photograph that was shown is a co-located facility, but it may not be the best design or camouflage that one would want. But there are a lot of other variables here. It may be possible that the base facility did go through the environmental review, did meet the state law requirement, in which case then a co-located antenna on that base facility would have to be approved by ministerial action. And
I'd simply like to add, as the person who worked with the league when this law was being drafted, very few sites within Glendale would fall into this particular category that would be mandatory for co-location because the law just became effective a couple of years ago. There are very stringent requirements. I would be surprised, frankly, if more than a relatively small handful of existing sites would even qualify. So in the hope that we will not focus on something that is really a very small component of this, but that we had to address because of state law, I wanted to make that clarification.
May I ask one question on that?
Certainly.
So when the CEQA document is prepared, typically CEQA does not let you add to a determination after the fact. So this actually stretches CEQA in a different
No,
way.
actually it doesn't, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
It's because to fall under the provisions of the state law, the current and the future elements would have to be disclosed and considered as part of the CEQA. And that's one of the reasons why this has such a little effect now.
Okay.
And one of the reasons why when we see elements marked on plans that say future, we consider them as if they were current elements, and sometimes they get struck and sometimes they don't. But it's a conscious decision that doesn't go back. We're not going back and changing history. We're going forward with this particular provision. But because the state law is there, we have to respect it, and that's why we have this particular class.
And just for that one time we review it, let me ask you one more question. So therefore, we will be approved in the negative declaration. It would pretty much give us the holding capacity, so to speak, of this co-located facility. And that determination would assume whatever the maximum carrying capacity would be that could be used up to that. We would not see something added after that.
That's correct.
Okay.
And again, if you think about it as an incentive, if a carrier comes in and proposes a co-location to begin with, and it's completely camouflaged, whether it's under Class 1 or Class 2, it may actually be more efficient to process it under Class 2 so that an additional site later that you will have considered and have gone through the EIR process or the NAGDEC process can be dealt with at the ministerial level, the staff level.
Thank you.
there are preferred styles that we've specified in the ordinance, the proposed ordinance, which requires visual and aesthetics impact analysis. And the preferred styles are, as listed here, fully camouflaged, have the underground placement of associated equipment and facilities to the extent feasible, are compatible with the community, they contain adequate screening and landscaping, have a minimum visual impact to surrounding areas, and comply with other existing design review standards. For preferred zones, the proposed ordinance will require to the greatest extent feasible that WTFs are concentrated in less sensitive zones such as commercial and industrial locations. If a wireless telecommunications facility must be located in sensitive areas such as residential or historic zones, the carrier will be required to demonstrate that there is a significant coverage gap, not just any coverage gap, but it has to be a significant coverage gap, which cannot be met by any alternative location or configuration, and the facility is the least intrusive means to close that significant coverage gap.
Is there a number to
Go ahead and ask about it. Yeah.
Significant coverage gap? Is it about 10%, 20%? What?
There was 5 people that wanted.
We've got some answers for you.
Oh, yeah, I walked all the way up here to not give you a very good answer. I have to be candid about it. The reality is that There isn't a hard and fast definition of what constitutes a significant coverage gap. There are a multitude of factors that were identified by the Ninth Circuit this year, probably 5 months ago, in a case coming out of Palos Verdes Estates. It considers things like, is the area residential or commercial? How many potential customers are there to be served? How many potential people live in that area? What are there roadways and railways running through such that there might be a greater sort of transient demand passing through demand? And that list is non-exhaustive. The court just said these are the types of things that need to be looked at, and the decision gets made on a case-by-case basis. Now, I'll offer my 2 cents on why the judicial system thinks that's good, because it creates risk for everybody. So somebody comes in and they say, I have a significant coverage gap. A local agency says, no, you don't. And it becomes in the best interest of both of those parties to work together to figure out a good solution amongst themselves, because the courts are saying, we're not going to give you a clear answer to this, and so you both take risk if you come to us.
So it's not just dependent on the actually area coverage, but it also depends on the density of the people that the antenna provides.
I do want to tell you something that is true about significant coverage gap analysis, and that is there are many carriers, and they are all entitled to coverage. So you can't have I'm not picking on anybody. You can't have a Verizon come in and say, I have a significant coverage gap in X area of your city, and you can't respond to them, well, Sprint has great coverage there, and so the community is covered. That's not how it works. The Telecommunications Act is set up to foster competition among carriers, which means they all are effectively entitled to coverage.
Do you feel a little bit like Justice Potter?
Yes, I no. The truth of the matter is, I don't know it when I see it either.
I'm not sure how obscure that was, but several people here laughed. Please. I'm sorry. Did you have something?
Yeah, while we're there, I guess just for some more clarification on that issue. Sure. To me, the significant service gap analysis will be integral part of, and it mentions that there's going to be an obligation of the carrier to identify for us why the unit would need to go there and what the impact is and what the design parameters are to make that happen. And I guess what I'm wondering is, will we have the leeway to define what they will be bringing us from the standpoint that I can think of a design and how you go from one area to the next area and how that relates. And if I think about it from the standpoint that if I'm putting one in today, I may want to put one in tomorrow, I may want to put in one a year from now. I personally feel that the obligation would be on the carrier to take that into consideration and let me know that. And because my reasoning is that if I don't just think about one unit, and I think about multiple units that may take place over the next 5 years, it may dictate putting it here versus there and give some options to the public or to the city as far as where that might go or what might be the best place for it.
First, I'd like you to know that we have thought about that.
Okay.
We, in one iteration of the ordinance, in fact, had the application requirements written into the ordinance, and then ultimately realized that more flexibility was going to be necessary over time, and so the planning director has the discretion to modify the requirements of the ordinance, or requirements of the application. But I will tell you that one of the requirements of the application is to disclose, to the extent you know, what your future development plans are. And there are two reasons for that. One is the reason that you articulated, because it feeds into the significant coverage gap analysis. Another is because it actually feeds into the prior question about co-location. Yep. It helps us to know what everybody is planning on doing to the extent we can when somebody comes in and says, well, I want to put a cell tower at X location. We could say, well, somebody else is planning on putting one, 2 doors down. Can we do something that's a co-located facility, do one instead of two? So that we have thought about that in the process. Now, let me give you the bad news. The bad news is that there is a reality out there, and that is that the telecommunications operators view all of this information as proprietary information. And at some point, when we say, tell us your business plans for the next 5 years, they justifiably are going to say no. or they'll say they don't know, either one of which is partially true. So we have the process built to consider that information. We know that the telecommunications carriers are aware that you view that information as relevant, and we hope that those two things combine to give us enough information to make sensible decisions.
My issue is not with the secrecy or the long-term plans from that standpoint, but more from the engineering or design standpoint that and go out far enough to know that if I think about it that way, it could impact where I put this particular station. And in fact, an example might be, depending on the cost, it might be more applicable to place more than one unit today, even if they're closer, but it might be a different look at how the design would be effective, and it might be more aesthetically acceptable to the community or to the city.
Well, here's another piece of good news that is partially responsive to what you just said, and that is that when a demonstration of a significant coverage gap is offered, effectively a carrier is going to show you a propagation map or something, some type of document that sort of shows you where the holes are. So they may not tell you what their future business plans are, but you can look at the map and see where the holes are. Now, I will say, because there are new entrants in this market as well, so those folks that come in with a plan to blanket your city with new facilities will more than likely come with all of their applications in a batch, because that's the most sensible way for you to do that analysis. And frankly, getting to your CEQA sort of piecemealing question that you were asking earlier, nobody can start a network with just one antenna. They need to come with 5 or 6 or 10 in order for it to make any business sense. And so it would look like piecemealing from a CEQA standpoint if you didn't do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I know we have a map like this, but do we have a map that shows exactly the coverage gaps?
I don't know.
No, we don't have that map. It's something that, frankly, literally changes from day to day because the carriers change their coverage goals. They will reorient antennas. They'll do different things. So while we could say you have to provide a map, it would be accurate for a very short period of time. That's why, rather than going that route, we say at the time you come in, we're going to ask you a lot of information. In fact, in the first iteration now of the application form, it's very specific as to the amount of information that's required, sufficient so that not only do we have an assertion of a gap, but we have a basis for the assertion, not just the bare assertion that it exists, so that we have factual data to deal with. And this is an area of significant gap. One of the reasons why it is so troubling for the courts is because there is no federal standard in play here. So it's very jello, and that's why we do ask for a lot of information. That's why we want to make informed decisions, but that's why we're also limited to making an informed decision at that time with whatever facts we have before us.
You raise an interesting comment when you talk about how the data is only good for such a short period of time, and it raises to me the specter, if you will, of a cell provider, cooking the data, tweaking something just to reinforce their need, and then on Monday they switch it back, something like that. And it also, and the second part of that is, we're talking some very technical things in terms of, does the city have to hire a consultant every time this comes in that can understand radio frequencies and all the ways that data can be manipulated?
Well, frankly, we're hoping that the applicants are going to come in with Class 1 facilities, or the most camouflaged facilities, where the aesthetic impact will be nil, and therefore it'll be the easiest planning process. What we're talking about is a process that will really become very important, where we have a lower, as it were, higher number but lower classification type of site, or a different classification type of site. Again, because these are very specific fact-based questions, that's when we start really digging. I'm afraid until the courts give us additional guidance, and until, frankly, we get more experience, as every city does when it employs or when it deploys a new wireless ordinance, we'll figure out what the issues are here. But that's one of the reasons why we wanted to leave it to director level approval to make the change in the application form, so that we could respond without having to go through a very cumbersome process to change the ordinance.
I just don't see how you can establish confidence in the gap in coverage conversation. I can see how in the process we can try to force the issue into the less restrictive zones and to force aesthetics, but the whole, whether they have coverage or not argument, basically it's going to be up to, the carriers don't do it because they like to do it. They do it because they see a financial need or a financial basis for it. But I don't see how anybody certainly on this dais and probably within the departments of the city could even begin to understand whether it's true or false about the coverage.
The issue of coverage also, there are several ways of demonstrating current coverage and plan coverage. And again, we have the flexibility through the planning process to require additional proof. For example, an actual drive test of what the current coverage is in the area. Now, you've raised the issue of cooking the data. In every single case that comes before you, you have to rely at some point on the accuracy of the information that's given to you, and you have to make certain assumptions as to how accurate it is. One of the reasons why it's a disincentive for an applicant to cook the data is because they will come back to us. They will be coming back to us. This is not a one-time project. They're back to us again and again and again, and where the data are different, that raises questions about the reliability. But I think we have to start with the presumption that we have data before us, and we have to question it. But I think we start out by assuming that the data is probably correct, subject to testing it. You've asked whether we have to hire an expert in each case. The procedure is there if the city determines that it needs expert help. In some cases, it's unlikely the city will need help. In some cases, it's very likely. But again, these are all the variables that go into there's no one-size-fits-all wireless project.
Based on the information, it sounds to me like the conversation's not going to be is there a need or not. That is going to be, well, the cell companies tell us they need it. I can't figure it out. They must need it, and then you just go on to the next step about where and how.
But even the where and how issue,
and that's a good fight to have,
right? And we still go to the second prong if there is a significant gap. And by the way, I look at wireless applications on behalf of lots of cities, and I will tell you that lots of applications come in where there is not a significant gap asserted. It's simply a desire to increase signal level in an existing area. So it's not always the case that an applicant will come in and say we have a significant gap in an area because, frankly, they run the risk of chicken littling the whole process. And again, because they come back to us, once they've burned us, it becomes all that much more pleasant to deal with the planners who have been burned.
How will we know that it wasn't successful or that they quote-unquote burned us?
Well, this is a process where, number one, most of the time I will tell you my experience. I've been doing this for 18 some odd years now for governments, mostly in California, but all the way to the East Coast. The carriers provide generally reliable information. The issue is the quality of the information more than the reliability. It's the difference between a projection of the coverage and a demonstration of what the current coverage is. It's computer projections versus drive tests to show what the current coverage is. And in some cases, drive tests are not necessary. Again, our focus here is to make these the least intrusive into the community and to make that the easiest process. This is a balance where we have an intrusive site. Is it the least intrusive site? Is it genuinely necessary? What are the alternatives? The law doesn't say we have to give a carrier the absolute cheapest solution to its coverage goals. That's one of the reasons why Jeff talked about the fact that we've always had the authority to control aesthetics, subject to and tempered by the issue that if there's a significant gap, we can't legislate it to the point where they can't provide their service.
Thank you.
Nothing else. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may, we also have in the city radio experts through the Information Systems Department, one of whom is here tonight, Mr. Steve Hronick. And I don't really want to speak to his abilities because I know so little, I'll probably get it all wrong. But we have had discussions with him about performing, kind of preliminary baseline analysis of just these kinds of questions. So he might take some comfort.
And it's timely. How about if we let you speak? Did you fill in a card, sir?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, anyway, identify yourself.
Steve Hronick, I'm the city's wireless communications administrator. I head the Wireless Communications Division of Information Services Department. Most of the people in my division have years of experience in RF. I have 34 years experience as an RF engineer. We've produced, I probably looked at thousands of propagation predictions. I'm the one who went out and found all the sites through spectrum analysis and with the help of Public Works Engineering, built that map. We can certainly see a map in-house and see if it looks legitimate. We know where the sites are. We can go out and do spectrum analysis and see if coverage is there or not. In many cases, it's going to be very obvious because there's a financial risk to carriers to put in a site. There has to be some benefit. So they're generally not going to come in with specious applications. Certainly not from an RF standpoint. They may come in asking for an additional site because they have a capacity issue. But we're prepared to assist planning and Public Works analyzing these applications. If it comes to the point that there's something that we have questions about, then we probably would want to bring in an independent third party to analyze it. But I honestly don't think this is going to be the biggest part of your decision-making process. It'll probably be quite minimal.
So what I'm hearing is the first line of defense, the city has in-house capacity to be able to do a smell test on the argument about coverage.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And we don't have to go out and find $500 an hour consultants or
That's
anything
right.
like that.
With all due respect to...
I'm probably undercutting him at 500. So
I'm sure he's worth far more than that. Although
it's taken a nasty turn, isn't it? So
Jonathan and I got along immediately. We're both RF propeller heads from way back.
Any questions?
Yeah,
for the
I mean, since you have so many years of experience with RF emissions, I know the health risks of RF emissions are very debatable and not very concrete. What are you aware of it? And we're obviously, I guess, trying to analyze how much RF emissions are happening. What are the health risks you know about for us to be, having those restrictions?
It's non-ionizing radiation, but beyond that, I have to defer to the FCC's OET 65 regulations.
And we will be getting into that.
We just can't. I'd be happy to talk to you in the hallway sometime, but I
we're
can't
precluded.
in a public forum. It's just not appropriate.
So you'll wait until we're all done and chat with them?
Sure. Or you can come by the radio shop anytime.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Not at this time. Thank you very much. Please continue.
I would also mention Exhibit D has a lot of information about human exposure to radio frequency emissions. There are preferred locations that are specified in the proposed ordinance, such as water tanks, utility towers and poles, commercial industrial buildings, government facilities. Just to mention that many of these are also in the public right-of-way, which, although they're not part of our consideration tonight, that is where many of these installations will take place. Public right-of-way and in existing light standards along public rights-of-way. In the significant gap analysis, this is probably a repeat or somewhat duplicative of what we've been discussing, but the WTF applicants must identify the geographic service area for the subject location. Propagation maps are one piece of evidence, but we would be requiring additional information such as possibly up to mock-ups and possibly a presentation to the commission if necessary, if there is a significant gap and there are extenuating circumstances with regard to that. All of the applicants' existing sites for the local service network associated with the coverage gap that the WTF is meant to close needs to be disclosed, and it'll describe, the application must describe how the significant coverage gap will be filled by the proposed installation. There's also an alternative site analysis, where the proposed ordinance requires an alternative site analysis. It will be to evaluate the availability and feasibility of potential alternative sites. The analysis must include a map showing other potential locations, and it must describe why the proposed location is superior to other locations. Factors that must be considered in the alternative site analysis include cost, visual benefits and detriments of the alternative sites, and proximity to single-family dwellings. The solution ultimately selected should be the least intrusive means of filling these gaps within providing a reasonable level of service. Getting to safety now, the radio frequency emissions, as we mentioned, there will be a performance certification. This will be required annually to ensure that WTFs comply with the most current regulatory and operational standards. And just to make sure that it is clear, all WTFs must comply with the FCC guidelines for exposure of RF emissions. While there is a debate, and it continues, on the appropriateness of these guidelines, we are prohibited from denying a permit based on the safety effects of radio frequency emissions. I can't stress this enough. It's specified both in state and federal law. There'll be security measures, such as requirements for fencing, screening, and security signage, and safety lighting to minimize downward illumination, and safety lightings or colors must be approved. With regard to expert review, the proposed ordinance provides for the retention of wireless telecommunications consultants who are experts in the field in order to assist city staff when necessary to evaluate the WTF permits. That will be within the discretion of the Director of Planning. Each project will be handled on an individual basis, and expert review is not a mandatory requirement for all applications. However, if a decision is made to retain an outside expert, the WTF application will not be deemed complete until the review is completed by the outside expert, and the outside expert would be paid for by the applicant. That is not a city cost. An outside expert may be required for such things as the evaluation of the coverage gap, which we've discussed, a review of the technology aspects of the project, the significant gap analysis, the alternative site analysis, least intrusive means analysis, the RF safety compliance with FCC regulations, and project aesthetics when they're related to technology aspects. The expert will be independent. He or she will be retained by the city and report to the city. And as I mentioned, cost recovery, the applicant will be responsible for payment of the expert's fees. There will be community notification. For zone properties, the community will be notified of all public hearings of the Planning Commission through publication in the local newspaper for at least 10 days in advance, a mailed notice to all persons within 500 feet, and posting of the property at least 10 days in advance. And finally, we have provided for you, this would be Exhibit E, the comments that I mentioned we took in the community meetings, as well as after those meetings by community and industry stakeholders. We've provided responses to those comments. They've included, in general areas, the setbacks, aesthetics. People are very concerned about the residential zones, what community notification is being given, co-location, and expert reviews. We can discuss any of these subjects, but I'd like to conclude my report at this point, and you can take questions. We would be happy to take questions from the Commission on these comments, or if you wish to hear from the public first, then we would take comments after that.
I suspect it may be a combination of both. Given the hearing, as we take comments from the public, commissioners feel free to interject and ask and continue the discussion. So I'll begin right now by taking public comment. First speaker card I have is Mr. Roach.
Good evening. My name is Rich Roach. I'm with AT&T. And as I stand here this evening, I find myself sort of in a difficult position because when you look at the demand for wireless services here in Southern California, it's reached an all-time high. The number of California wireless users has doubled over the past 4 years. In fact, the traffic on our wireless data network has quadrupled in the past year. We find ourselves racing as fast as we can to accommodate our customers' almost insatiable need for reliance on their cell phones, their PDAs, laptops. So many different applications are coming up all the time. So what I find uncomfortable or difficult is that residents and communities all over Southern California expect reliable cell service. And at the same time, we're faced with a very tough 120-page ordinance. So at the end of the day, I have engineers, network planners, finance people working to keep their heads above water as there's a growing and evolving needs of our customers. But there comes a point where companies such as mine won't be able to comply because of the time, money, and complexity involved to do so. Don't get me wrong, AT&T has been part of the Glendale community for more than 100 years, and we plan on being here for at least another 100 years. But I'm saying that it's a very challenging ordinance, one that will increase our cost of doing business in Glendale and also extend our build timeframes. It's not optimum for us, but we want to continue serving our customers here. Because our goal here and always is to find solutions that are good for the city, good for residents, and also good for our company. There are 3 significant areas of concern for us. The first one, we've been talking quite a bit about it. The phrase significant gap in coverage is widely used as a standard for evaluating wireless facilities if they're necessary in an area. This is a useful concept, but it's important to understand that the meaning of this phrase will evolve as wireless usage and technology continue to evolve and expand. For example, there may be coverage in an area during the dead of night, but then call congestion occurs during rush hours and prevents calls from being made. This is as much of a coverage gap as if there is no site at all in the area. AT&T needs to continue to deploy new and also expand existing facilities to keep up with the growing use of wireless-based services. Another one is setbacks. We know that the city leaders have been hearing from residents who want increased setbacks for the placement of wireless facilities. We commend the city staff for properly resisting these efforts and making clear that there are federal limits on local powers in this area. Expanded setbacks specifically target wireless facilities run a risk of effectively prohibiting wireless service in a given area. The plan to apply setbacks to facilities in the public right-of-way may be in conflict with federal and state limits on local zoning if those standards result in inability to close a significant gap of coverage. My last concern is frequency emission studies. The proposed requirement of annual or even more frequent RF emission reports is redundant and unnecessary. It adds cost without providing additional benefits to the city or its residents. The FCC has exclusive jurisdiction over this area. All carriers are required to comply with FCC requirements. And so Glendale, a suggestion would be Glendale can accomplish the same thing by simply requiring each carrier to provide an annual certification of compliance with FCC rules and regulations. We're committed to being flexible, to work with the community and the city to make this all work. The one thing that I ask is that you strongly consider the carrier's needs for flexibility also in placement and how we do our business. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A question for the speaker?
Yeah, a question. I think from what I've been hearing, you're concerned with the significant gap. You raise concern over, a different time of the day, having a different needs. But I thought that was part of the equation where there was a density or demand required. That is a part of the the gap analysis where you can apply to fulfill your needs. So I don't know.
Excuse me.
Yes, I don't know why that became your concerns. And the second question is that the frequency emitting setting, I thought we were going accordingly to the FCC rules. So do you find that this ordinance is beyond that and then more restrictive?
To answer the first question, as far as that coverage gap, it's trying to make sure that people understand the complexity of what we're looking at. It's just not taking your cell phone around and saying, oh, it works here. Because your cell phone may work there at 10 o'clock at night. But as Mr. Kramer was talking about, as more traffic gets on the network, you may not be able to complete a call. So it's just trying to address that same complexity that he was addressing and helping people understand that this is a tough thing. It's just not a simple fact of your phone doesn't work here or it works there. As far as the emission studies, within the ordinance, as I interpreted it, it was asking for a different level of review and studies. We provide information already to the FCC, and my request is just saying we want to provide that same information to the city.
I'd like to hear your response to that, please.
Mm-hmm.
I hesitate to call it rebuttal. It's more expansive.
It's ongoing discussion.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But you can rebut them later. No, thank
Okay,
you, sir.
thank you very much.
Next speaker card, Leslie Daigle.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. My name is Leslie Daigle. I represent Verizon Wireless. And it's pretty simple. We respond to citizen demand. That's why we build these facilities. And I think citizens and businesses everywhere are looking for government to become more simple. And the fact that this is over 100 pages, I mean, it's beginning to resemble the health care bill. And I think it can be said more simply. And I mean that as a serious concern, because part of one of the things that happens now in government, when there's lots of administration and lots of interpretation, then sometimes things can be delayed. I'm sure it's baffling to citizens, and it seems to us to be very extensive and difficult. And certainly in the community that I reside in, we have very high aesthetic standards and very high property values, and we've managed to regulate this in 10 pages. And we had the same law firm write the ordinance. And so I guess I would ask you to consider, is there a policy direction that we can perhaps do this more simply, in a more simple fashion than in over 100 pages. And I question if sometimes if it's deliberately extensive and deliberately convoluted so that we all sort of throw up our arms and say, well, let's defer to the lawyers and not really have a simple ordinance that we all can understand. The Industry Association made some comments that we generally agree with, and we also have some specific concerns about noticing, and we think that should be uniform. I believe there's a provision in here that gives staff the opportunity to expand a radius if they see fit, and we would like uniformity and consistency with noticing. Secondly, landscaping, we think some of that should undergo the common sense test. If it's a 10-story building and if it's antennas, do we need to file a landscaping plan? And then the other areas, the real emphasis of our concerns, I talked a little bit to outside counsel and to your attorney beforehand, is some of the business terms, for example, bonds in the city. We would like the opportunity to be able to post a bond and not cash deposit. We're very opposed to doing cash deposits. And then secondly, in terms of insurance requirements, we are self-insured, and we appreciate explicit, direct regulation and not having to hash out on an administrative level that this argument about self-insurance, and that the council can say or the commission can say within certain parameters, self-insurance is acceptable. So those are, our emphasis is really on business terms, insurance, and bond requirements. And then, let me see if I have any other points. As far as the independent review, we have actually found Mr. Kramer's comments in many cases to be credible, and there is a complexity to this type of engineering that I think one has to evaluate. Who would you want to be your expert witness? An independent expert or kind of someone from the police department. And so that's why, although we're in an economic climate that we all want to save money, we actually welcome independent expertise because of the complexity of these networks.
And since you get to pay for them, we're
There
revenue
you go.
neutral.
I know. I saw that. That was good to slip that in.
We
and
were
I-
just looking out for you when we brought it up.
There you go. So those are, Mr. Chair and Commissioners, our comments are really pertaining to those business terms. If you could help provide even, what would be helpful to us, even direction that we can work it out with them, that would be great. And I think that would be sufficient, that if we can just have that dialogue and discuss it and see where it goes from there. So thank you.
Question for the Speaker, Mr. Lee?
Well, I guess not for the speaker, more of, I guess, a question to the staff or the people who have, prepared this report or ordinance. She brought up a few points here regarding requiring landscape plan when it's up on the 10-story building or something like that. Is that, do you have a cookie sheet, application or requirements that unnecessarily go through that?
Mr. Lee, let me suggest that you raise the questions, and then we let him hear the speakers. Maybe he can address them all at one time.
Sure. Even later. Later, right, sure. And then also,
then he can prepare for the.
And another question is that the posting of the bond rather than cash deposit seems reasonable to me. So is that something that you need to consider? And also, same thing with the insurance requirements as well.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Please.
With regard to the business terms, that is regarding the public right-of-way. Those are for encroachment permits and excavation permits. Nothing in Title 30 has to do with...
Yeah, but most of those would allow bond instead of cash.
Well, that would
You
be
can
within the
pursue it.
discretion of the city engineer.
Yeah, yeah.
But as I explained to Ms. Daigle, we generally do accept surety bonds for encroachment or excavation permits.
Sounds
but
like
it
an easy
depends
thing
on
to
the
address.
application.
Okay.
Depends on the application.
All right. Any other comments for the Speaker that had returned to the seat? The only comment I would have is this is the second speaker and the second time somebody's brought up the length of it. And I would just point out that a lot of the length is just due to the way it has to get planted into our titles, and the actual act itself is probably 10 pages or less. It's just where it has to get scattered in. So you can keep bringing up the length of it, but it is what it is. All right, next speaker card, John McMahon.
We also tried to combine a couple people's comments. Another one here, and then because the block had to leave, Suzanne Edwards. So hopefully we can get 3 or 4 extra minutes.
Well, we'll
Tim, can we find a time?
just make it interesting, and we'll go with it.
All right, cool. So
I'm sorry, who was the card that had to leave?
Suzanne Edwards and Marguerite Lincoln just ceded her time to me.
I don't even have a card from the other, but okay, go ahead.
My name is John McMahon. I live at 509 Cumberland, which is the site of the now revoked, thankfully, T-Mobile permit that sort of began this push. I want to acknowledge, first of all, the work of Mr. Melching and Mr. Kramer, Ms. Sansoni, and the whole city staff. I've actually seen this PowerPoint about 3 times now, and I know you guys have all just seen it once, but raise your hand if you saw a home anywhere in there. And there's no home in there. You didn't see that because all this sort of disguising and camouflaging, almost all of this, and a lot of the great areas and the improvements, in my opinion, on this act are for the commercial area. And the movement began because there was a 3.5-story tower in front of a 1-story home in a residential area. And so the first question you ask is, what's changed about that? What will prevent that from happening again? And there really is very little. What's happened is we've changed around some of the players. Someone in one planning group has now been replaced by someone in another planning group. The employee who said he reviewed applications and can justify the RF requirements, that didn't actually happen. And if you ever want to go on our website and look at a YouTube video where you go around the neighborhood and with a T-Mobile phone, you'll see that not only there is good coverage, but also that the carriers themselves has already admitted, in publicly that they don't agree themselves on gap in coverage and things like that. So I think Mr. Melching sort of hit it on the nose when he said we don't want an ordinance that on its face is rejected, because all that's going to do is allow a carrier to steam in. So I think that's 100% right. I think the question is, what can we do and what are we actually doing in this ordinance? So I think it's a great start, but there's a couple things to note. I think the Anacortes decision and the Palos Verdes decision, unless I'm wrong, the first draft of this was written before both of those actually came out. So we had an initial draft that actually didn't take into account some of these changes, which are actually helping cities and helping residents actually change the law. We're also observing this in a lot of other cities. So Albany, California, Richmond, California, Pasadena, California, Glendale, California. The list goes on and on. Everyone's dealing with this. Mr. Kramer actually works for a lot of these cities. He's got a great portfolio of work he does. And one of the things I've learned from going out and sort of following him around to different cities is how he is in Pasadena is different because Pasadena gets to decide what they want to do with that information. So if you go to a Pasadena City Council meeting, which I've been to several, a couple of which you've been there, it's a completely different focus because Pasadena is doing something that's very corporate, very pro-commercial, very anti-homeowner, in my opinion. And as their council, you say, okay, if that's your sort of perspective, that's your point of view, we'll work with you on that. So, from the flip side, Glendale gets to decide what we want to do. And the residents who came down to City Council actually made a statement about that. And you'll hear a lot throughout this about you can't do what federal law prohibits. But the reason there's like 10 high-priced lobbyists charging by the hour here is because of what you can actually do here. And if you wait for it to be sort of like unknown reasonable definition, then it's too late, and you're sort of like trying to write code like you did today on the Salem apartments, and do your best to come up with a definition of reasonable on the spot. So I think we don't want to take an extreme view, but we don't, and we don't think we are taking an extreme view. So I think it's either Richmond or Albany says there's no towers prohibited in residential areas. To me, that's an extreme view. We realize they have to be there in some capacity. So the question is, what's reasonable and what's reasonable for residential setback? So in our neighborhood, we have a lot of places that have no sidewalks, for example. The grass goes all the way out to the curb, which means your setback is actually under your lawn, which is where they're going to put the cell tower. And if you're wondering, are there more coming? There's 23 in queue, waiting for the moratorium to end. So there are a lot of them coming. So they're possibly coming to a house near you in your neighborhood, maybe your house, and we don't even know it. So I think what's reasonable, 0 feet from your house is not reasonable. That's what's in the ordinance right now. Someone can go, here's the edge of your house, here's the edge of where I'm going to put the tower. That to me is not the definition of reasonable. It's also not the definition under Palos Verdes and Anacortes of what the city can reasonably legislate. If you said San Diego, for example, they have in San Diego 50 feet, or the height of the tower. That's a lot of feet from your house. Maybe we can't go 50 feet. Maybe we can't say we're prohibiting the tower. But 0 feet is totally unreasonable to protect residential neighborhoods. So, and I would say some of this is known, and we've made these comments. In your comments, your packet that you have, if you look at number 17, there's something in there that says, setting minimum setbacks from residential uses where feasible are appropriate. So that's that area we're talking. We're wondering, okay, so what's the answer? What is appropriate? What's reasonable? Mr. Roach, Mr. Howard, all these people from industry, they're going to say, we'll be flexible, trust us. But the one thing we learned last year is not to actually trust them. They've broken the public trust about 911. They lied about capacity, coverage. They actually have, industry has a record. There are cities where they've proven the propagation maps are incorrect. So all these things we can sort of put into their trust. They haven't earned the public trust for that. And the whole idea of this, Mayor Draymond, now Councilman Draymond, I guess, said the goal was to write a robust ordinance that actually doesn't put this in the hands of a few people in a room trying to figure it out. That's not an exact quote, but it's pretty close to an exact quote of what his goal was that day that the moratorium put into effect. So I don't think we're there. I think it's a great start. I think we've got a lot in there. I don't think it's too long. I don't think something good can be too detailed. But I think there's a lot you can do, and I'm going to request that you do it. Thank you.
Questions for the speaker?
What was the speaker's name again?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is John McMahon.
Okay, thank you.
So are you affiliated with GoAct? Is that?
Yeah, GoAct is the organization we've established in Glendale to basically protect against the proliferation of cell towers. And that's both in residential neighborhoods that are, multifamily and single family.
May I ask the speaker a question?
Of course.
I'm looking at comment number 19 and the comments that you brought up. You mentioned residential setback being 75% of tower height or 15 feet, whichever is larger. Is that sort of a logarithmic element height?
I think it's a great question. What we tried to do is actually we thought throughout this series of city meetings that the city at some point was saying, throw out an answer, like if you want to participate, throw it out. So we thought, okay, San Diego, I believe, has sort of this triangular rule where it's 50 feet or the height of the tower, whichever is greater. So if you have the 30 feet, it can get less, and it's reasonably. So there's sort of this triangle between your home and this thing, and that sort of made sense. So we said, okay, it looks like we can't go that far. What's reasonable? We actually have tried to come up with things that aren't extremes, that have tried to be flexible. Our definition of flexible, though, is some protection for the neighborhood. It's not nothing. So we sort of came up with that based on some other regulations that we're seeing around in other cities.
Thank you.
Mr. Lee.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I looked at class 1 through 7, and I don't think you can put any type of camouflage when you have such a high tower in your backyard or in front yard. So I kind of see your